Chapter 1087. In the dark night, Roddy and Natha leaped down from the sky. They circled above the city for a while, and then slowly landed in a corner of the city. Now, Roddy could easily use low-level spells. With the help of the magic tentacles, he could adjust his body's balance. Nada, who was held in his arms, was too shy to say anything from beginning to end. As a fortress, Rasha City had taller walls than ordinary cities. Compared to the stone city walls of the Kingdom of Karen, which were generally less than 4 meters tall, Rasha City had trained a large number of mages after the founding of the country. Therefore, they were willing to spend money on infrastructure. The original city wall was only about 4 meters tall, but after the founding of the country, the mages expanded it to about 7 meters tall and more than 5 meters wide. It looked quite spectacular. But now, the impregnable city was vulnerable to the enemy. And because the city wall was too tall, the army of Rasha City could not fight back. It was ridiculous. Of course, standing at the foot of the city wall, Roddy did not think that the mages of Rasha City were stupid. After all, the anti-magic weapon was not something that would appear in a conventional war. If his own army suddenly encountered it, they would definitely suffer a great blow. We will meet here after the survey. 2 hours. Understood. Natha let go of Roddy's arm and was about to leave with her short bow. However, Roddy grabbed her hand and continued, "If you find any suspicious targets, do not get too close. Safety first." "Okay, I know." She was never good at expressing herself. She just squeezed Roddy's hand and did not say anything else. She stepped forward silently and quickly disappeared into the darkness. After receiving the essence from the Green Dragon Lord, her stealth ability and combat strength had been greatly improved. Simple reconnaissance and survey were not difficult for her at all. This could even be said to be the basic skills of an agent in the intelligence agency. Roddy didn't go with her because he wanted to investigate the anti-magic weapon. As the saying goes, know yourself and know your enemy, and you will always be victorious. Roddy didn't want to wait for the army to experiment on human lives. As the Prime Minister, he should not be putting himself in such danger. However, Sally's illness had left him with no time to wait for Sodeler to arrive. More importantly, the anti-magic weapon might be closely related to the destruction of the High Elves. Figuring it out might have a huge impact on the war that was bound to happen in the future. Moreover, Roddy's strength was so strong that he could escape unscathed even if he were to face the dragons head-on. With such a scattered city, unless an existence like the ancient behemoth appeared, it would not be able to trap him at all. Walking along the deserted street, Roddy confirmed that there was a strict curfew in Lasya City. However, due to the lack of manpower, the patrolling soldiers were very sparse. He easily entered the city and found that there was no chaos as he had imagined. Under normal circumstances, there would often be scenes of soldiers robbing people or even humiliating women in the street. However, Lasya City was obviously maintaining an unimaginably orderly order. The closer he got to the core area, the stricter the military discipline became. Hearing the creaking sound of a wooden cart, Roddy climbed up to the stone building next to him. After observing for a moment in the shadow, he found that the soldiers were gathering the food they had found in the city and storing it. It was obvious that they were preparing to fight a protracted war with Lasman. "Too slow. We have to transport all 120 carts of food before dawn." The sudden voice made Roddy stunned for a moment. This was because the words should have been spoken by the evil supervisor, but at this time, he heard a woman's voice. He searched for a while and immediately found that there was a strong woman watching the caravan from the side. She was wearing a well-designed leather armor. She was strong because she was taller than the coolies in front of her. At the same time, she had broad shoulders and long arms. The bulging muscles on her buttocks and thighs were very strong. Somehow, it reminded Roddy of the Chun-Li style in his memory. Sure enough, there's the Took clan. The supervisor was a woman from the Took clan, which meant that the leaders of the army in the city were probably related to the Took clan. Roddy was sure of this. When he was about to follow the clues, he suddenly heard the mission panel light up. In fact, after arriving at Lasman, there were many green or gray triggered missions in the mission panel. It was the same as the Messenger mission in ordinary games, which was a way to earn EXP. Roddy directly ignored it. But after thinking for a while, he still stopped and took a look. This time, the triggered mission was yellow. He raised his eyebrows and found out that the mission name was Save the Took clan. Roddy was a little puzzled. As the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Karen, why did I have to save the Took clan? The reason why the Took clan got involved in the war is far from simple. As the natives of the continent, they are far more aware of the danger than ordinary people can imagine. But now that the crisis is imminent, the path of self-redemption is blocked. If they want to get out of this predicament, they can only rely on external forces. First of all, investigate the Took clan's predicament and understand their real crisis. This was obviously a series of missions. The first reward was experience points, but other than that there was nothing else. Roddy directly closed the mission panel because he no longer cared about the series of missions. Back when he fought with Augustine, it was because he and the Kingdom of Karen were in a life-threatening crisis. Now that he was in a high position, his level, skills, and equipment had all reached a high level, he had no interest in this kind of time-consuming and laborious mission unless the reward was tempting. Right now, the most important thing was to investigate the anti-magic weapon. As for the life and death of the Took clan, Roddy did not care at all. Logically speaking, it would be better if they were all dead. It would save him the trouble of mobilizing the army to fight. With that thought in mind, Roddy found a relatively tall building to observe the distribution of the city. Soon, he found a military camp full of elite soldiers. After getting closer to observe, he found that these soldiers were well armed. At the same time, they all had fair skin, obviously having the bloodline of the Took clan. As he was observing, a tower next to him suddenly lit up. Only then did Roddy realize that the soldiers below were obviously guarding the tower. After activating the stealth skill, Roddy quietly jumped to the second floor of the tower and slowly climbed up. When he was about 10 meters high, Roddy suddenly found a large number of notifications popping up in front of him. Helmet magic effect disappears. Necklace magic effect disappears. Chest armor magic effect disappears. There was also a new icon in the status bar. On it was a red symbol of a sharp fang. It said, "All spells in the anti-magic area cannot be used." Roddy clearly felt his body become heavier. This was because his equipment was not light. However, because of the ingenious levitation array, it was no different from a cloth robe when he walked. At this time, all the magic effects had disappeared. Even the additional attributes of strength had changed. His hand that was holding onto the wall tightened. For a moment, he felt an inexplicable sense of panic. People with power were most afraid of losing this power. At this moment, Roddy finally felt the fear that the High Elves had faced. When the magic that they relied on for survival completely disappeared, who could face the flood of beastmen calmly? Please remember the original domain name of this book. The fastest website for mobile version. Chapter 1088. After coming to this world, Roddy had already experienced two ways of anti-magic. The first time was when he was exploring Elson City. This city was sealed by the enchantment of time. At that time, because the enchantment collapsed, an elemental vacuum appeared in the city, causing all elemental spells to be unable to be released in the area. At that time, Roddy was not as panicked about anti-magic as he was now. Because his level was not high at that time, his equipment was not strong, and he only relied on a short bow to explore the world. It did not matter if he had spells or not. The other time was when he faced Body some time ago. The miracle released by the priest Panda compared to the elemental vacuum, The anti-magic area, condensed by the power of the gods, was much stronger. Except for magic, all other kinds of spells could not be released in the area. At that time, Roddy did not panic too much because he had the help of 5 dragons. Without spells, he could beat the enemy with his fists. But now, standing alone in the enemy city, the feeling of suddenly losing 80% of his combat power was no less than stepping on a cliff. He clenched his teeth and tried to calm his breathing. Then he stood on a slightly flat bulge. He did this because he needed to calm down. Roddy could feel his thighs trembling slightly. Because of the momentary panic just now, his adrenaline secreted too much. He wiped his forehead and found that it was full of cold sweat. Closing his eyes, Roddy took a few deep breaths and then closed the large number of information prompts in front of him. He looked up and climbed up again without hesitation. If he gave up when he encountered such a setback, then Roddy might as well go back to the kingdom of Karen and wait for death. Even without the bonus of equipment, his level was still there. His strength, far beyond that of a normal human, was enough for him to climb the tower without falling. But to be safe, it still took him nearly 3 minutes to climb to the top. Quietly standing outside the window on the top floor, Roddy could hear intermittent voices coming from inside. After confirming that there was no one around, he hid in the shadows and quietly looked over. A few figures were busy in the dark room. The first thing Roddy saw were 6 tall warriors in armor with short swords hanging from their waists standing by the door. They were obviously highly skilled guards. In the middle of the room were 2 slender women from the Thuk tribe. Roddy had learned about the Thuk tribe's clothing tradition from Evelyn. The woman with the complicated neckline was obviously the superior, and the one with the plain neckline was the subordinate. The room was very spacious, but it was filled with stacks of spherical objects. Roddy squinted his eyes and observed for a moment. He realized that these balls were actually cannonballs used by catapults. It was about the size of a coconut, but it was obviously not a heavy stone. The subordinate didn't have to exert much effort to carry it. After putting it on the ground, the superior, wearing a long robe, took out a strange fragment from a wooden box and carefully placed it into the notch of the cannonball. Then, she softly chanted an incantation. Roddy frowned at this scene. His heart was full of doubts. Could this be the anti-magic weapon that Jeremy mentioned? If it was so easy to create an anti-magic effect in an area, then wouldn't it be a little too easy? The miracle that Priest Panda released was something that had not appeared in the continent for a long time, but it was actually mass-produced here. Roddy absolutely did not think that anti-magic was something that could be achieved with such a low threshold. There were too many speculations in his heart. He even thought of jumping in and snatching a piece back to study. However, when he stretched out his hand to pull his bow, Roddy reluctantly gave up on this idea. There was no other reason. This bow was made by Lord Victor. In order to strengthen its power, the materials used were all of the highest quality. Therefore, the weight of a hard pull was very high. Roddy could only use it with the support of a magic circle. Now that the magic circle on this superb short bow was ineffective under the anti-magic effect, not to mention shooting, Roddy could not even pull it. This situation was probably something that even Lord Victor did not expect. In order to move more conveniently, Roddy did not carry any other weapons. Using the dagger on the side of his boots to fight with 6 fully armored warriors was obviously not a wise move. Most of the skills of Roddy's Witcher profession consumed stamina, so his skills were not too affected by the anti-magic effect. However, with the equipment ineffective and the identity of the 2 Thuk women mysterious, Roddy would not act rashly at this time. His original purpose of coming here was to investigate. Now that he had found his target, he might as well start to keep watch. Repetitive work was very tiring. The 2 Thuk women worked for an hour before they finally stopped to rest. Faint voices of conversation drifted into his ears. "Be careful, don't touch the ground. The quantity is enough. The language used by the two women was somewhat different from Lasman's. Their accent was also very strange. Roddy could only vaguely make out what they were saying. After that, he heard the sound of the door opening. The two women left. The guards locked the wooden box and then continued to carry out their task. When he heard someone coming to the window, he quickly changed his angle and hid. After holding his breath for a few minutes, the two Tuck women had already left the tower and walked away along the alley under the escort of the servants. The anti-magic effect was still there. Roddy thought for a moment and did not go to steal the things in the house. Instead, he jumped down from the tower. The moment he left the anti-magic field, all the magic circles and energy in his equipment resumed operation. It was no exaggeration to say that he felt as if he had taken off some heavy shackles. Even breathing was a lot easier. Lightly landing on a roof, Roddy silently followed the team that was leaving. Perhaps because this was the core area, there were only 4 servants following the 2 of them. The woman walking in the middle had a strong aura, and all the soldiers along the way bowed to her. The subordinate next to her said goodbye halfway. It seemed that because her position was not high, she did not have any servants following her. The torches on both sides vaguely illuminated the road. Occasionally there were soldiers passing by. This was the safest area in La City. She never thought that there would be any accidents at this time. Huff! A strange muffled sound made her stop. She frowned and looked to the right. She found that there was a shaking arrow on the stone wall. Suddenly she realized something. When she was about to shout, she felt a pain in her neck, and then everything in front of her was plunged into darkness. Roddy pulled out the arrow and put it back into the quiver. The paralyzed Tuck woman happened to lean on his back. She was tightly bound by magic tentacles. In order to prevent her from waking up, he even covered her mouth tightly. After confirming that no one was around, Roddy took a step forward and quickly disappeared into the darkness with the woman. End of this chapter. Chapter 1089. You can't find her? It was not until noon the next day that an angry shout came from the Core Command Center of Raxia City. Just 20 meters away, and she's gone? The Tuck tribe's commander, Kasley, was furious. She was like a lion when she spoke. She was 185 meters tall. Although she was not wearing the heavy armor on the battlefield, she was only wearing a leather vest, and the row of Tuck women kneeling on the ground did not even dare to breathe. I told you to be careful, and the guards must follow you at all times. Did you pretend you didn't hear me? She took a deep breath and suppressed her anger. Let's not talk about her for now. Are the things missing? General Kasley, we've just counted the number of cannonballs and the number of fragments. Nothing is missing. This news made her heave a sigh of relief. After walking back and forth 3 times, this burly general sat down on a chair. His Majesty has given us a mission, and we must not make any mistakes. Now even if Lockman and those guys know the use of these weapons, they can't do anything about it. However, those who disobey orders must be punished according to military law. Serena will be demoted by 2 ranks and punished with 30 lashes. Although you're a priest, His Majesty has given me full authority to take charge of this operation, and you're also under my jurisdiction. Now I'll give you a chance to explain yourself. The latter lowered her head and admitted her punishment. It's my negligence that led to Mag's disappearance. I admit it, General. Looking at the slender subordinate being dragged out to be executed, General Kasley nodded with satisfaction. She turned to her advisor and asked, "What's the enemy's movement?" "There are 2 armies building ladders outside the southern city wall in the morning, but there are only 4,000 of them in total. I think there will be a tentative attack in the afternoon." These people never learn from their mistakes," Kasley sneered. "Hold on for another week, and then I'll go and chop off the heads of those magic casters myself." She turned her gaze to her subordinates in front of her, but frowned slightly. "You guys stay away from those fragments. The guards will be rotated every day. I always feel that there's something wrong with those things. Yes, General. I'm just a servant of Priestess Serena. I really don't know what those things are. Mag, who was sitting in the wilderness, was sweating profusely as he tried to explain his identity. I'm just a servant of Priestess Serena. Of course, she now understood that she had fallen into the enemy's hands. In her memory, Lassiman's army did not have the concept of ransom to buy prisoners of war. This was because the enemy was very vexed at the current battle. Some of the Tuck soldiers and officers who were captured in the battle before were all beheaded in public. The women of the Tuck tribe were stronger than the men, but that didn't mean they all had iron wills. As a servant, Mag wasn't an important figure to begin with, so before Roddy had a chance to torture her, she had already confessed everything. My lord, I'm definitely not lying. I'll do anything you want me to, just don't kill me. Natha pursed her lips, obviously feeling that this guy had no backbone. However, Roddy was expressionless. He sat on a stool made of earth elements opposite her and continued to ask, "What are those cannonballs made of?" "Fruit. It's a kind of fruit produced in the oasis deep in the desert. It's very light but very round. It can be thrown much farther than ordinary stone cannonballs." "Where did those things in Priestess Serena's hands come from?" She answered without hesitation. "His Majesty gave them to me. Every priest took a bag of them when we went out to battle." "What does it look like exactly?" "They're all fragments. I don't know what they are exactly. They look like smashed stones or wood. Priestess Serena never allowed anyone to take them. If you put it in that fruit, it will have the anti-magic effect." No. When the fragments are piled up together, they will have the effect, but when they are separated, they will disappear quickly. I don't know why." She saw Roddy frowning, afraid that he would torture her, so she quickly added, "But after the priest dealt with the fragments, they will produce the effect you mentioned when the cannonballs explode." Roddy did not say anything. Obviously, the key to the problem was those fragments. As for the priest's spell, it should be some kind of treatment, but Mag was just a servant, so he was not qualified to learn such a spell. Although this spineless Thuck woman did not know the key information, for Roddy, he had a general idea of the core and the problem. As an unexpected surprise, Mag knew the distribution of the whole city's soldiers. Among the 2,000 soldiers, 500 were the Thuck elites, and even the leader was a Thuck, while the other 1,500 were miscellaneous soldiers from the neighboring countries. In fact, the whole army had 5,000 soldiers before they attacked Raxia City. It was not that they suffered heavy casualties during the attack, but that almost 1,000 of the miscellaneous soldiers ran away when they saw the situation was not right. If General Casley had not killed hundreds of them, they would not have been able to take down this city. After listening to the details for a while, Roddy felt a headache. Why did it sound like the militias in the Middle East on Earth, who used AKs as their whips? This kind of fighting style of rookies was really difficult for the Thuck general. Mag did not know what Roddy was thinking. In order to save her life, she had spilled everything that she should not have said, and provided an important piece of information that surprised Roddy. "You said the reinforcements will arrive in a week." Yes, that's what the general said. We only need to defend and wait for reinforcements." This news made Natha's expression turn serious. She looked at Roddy, who narrowed his eyes as if calculating something. After a while, he nodded. "We can make it." This sentence came out of nowhere, and Mag was confused. Ever since she woke up, she had been guessing the identity of this group of people, but until now, she still could not figure out what they were doing. There were only 2 shabby tents and a strange-looking large magic formation on the barren land in front of her. Among the 7 of them, 2 were interrogating her, and the other 5 were casting spells not far away, even though they were dressed in Razaman-style robes. "Oh yes. If we were to go to your capital from here, do you know the way?" Roddy's sudden question stunned Mag. She opened her mouth wide for a few seconds. Why you want to, forget it if you don't want to. Seeing a magic tentacle suddenly rise from Roddy's back, Mag shouted, I know the way! I know the way! Don't kill me! Don't kill me! Roddy's eyebrows kept twitching. Natha glanced at her, and her lips twitched. There are no clothes for you to change into here. The captive Mag's face was as red as a monkey's, but because she realized she had wet her pants from the shock just now, please remember the domain name of this book. The fastest website for mobile version, M. Chapter 1090. I reckon there will be a lot of captives. Let's keep her for now and verify her statement later. Roddy walked to the magic circle after he finished speaking, and began to write down the information he had just obtained. Anti-magic was a very broad concept, but after Zhao Yan understood the specific mechanism of this weapon, he would naturally not be like Lockman's troops, who could only charge in blindly. At this moment, Roddy could see Lockman's troops outside Lasha City had begun their probing attack. Of course, the 4,000 troops were not used to attack the city. The commander of Lockman's troops was no fool. He seemed to know that the soldiers had assembled long-range weapons like catapults to attack the city walls from afar, and at the same time, there were many fireballs with bright trajectories. Such a scene naturally attracted the attention of the other mages. However, they realized that only a few of the fireballs exploded within the city walls. Those that landed on the city walls were completely extinguished the moment they got close to the city walls. There was no fire or smoke at all. What's going on? Roddy asked Mag directly, and the latter answered immediately. It's because the priests on the city walls smashed those fruits to create an anti-magic zone. After every cannonball is smashed, the effect will last for about 2 hours. Regardless of whether it's the fireball or any other magic, it will be destroyed within the zone. This explanation was basically the same as what Roddy had guessed. Obviously, the Tuck's use of anti-magic was still very primitive. None of them could summon the anti-magic zone, like Panda's priests. As long as there were no shards or cannonballs embedded in the shards, everything would be fine. Just as he had this thought, Roddy saw the notification of Mission Completed on the mission panel. He blinked as he activated the teleportation of the documents on the magic circle. He opened the mission panel again and again, and realized that the first step of the Save the Tucks mission had actually been completed. Through your investigation, you found out that the appearance of the Tucks on this battlefield is closely related to the unknown shards. The appearance of the anti-magic zone is not a coincidence. What caused them to attack Lockman, and what do these shards mean? Roddy did not expect to complete the first step of the mission after asking a few questions from the prisoners of war. Now, the target of this series of missions was obviously those shards. He had already received the EXP reward for the quest. At the same time, the reward for the second step of the series was still EXP. It seemed that there was still no value in completing it. However, Roddy would not complain about the lack of EXP. On the other hand, his reputation with the Thuk tribe had inexplicably increased by 400 points, indicating neutral. What is the meaning of all this? Roddy was baffled and closed the mission panel. His attention was not on the task at all. When he looked up at the city of Rassia again, he found that the besieging troops were still throwing stones and casting magic projectiles to test the situation. It seemed that they were trying to find out the pattern of the anti-magic area. As the sky gradually darkened, the commotion in the distance gradually died down. The troops on the periphery were either gathering or eating. They didn't seem to be in a hurry. Do you guys fight like this? Roddy finally could not help but ask a few sorcerers who were busy at the side. Anderson's face twitched and he explained, in fact, under normal circumstances, when attacking a city, we only need to cover it with a group of spells, and then prepare to climb the city wall. But now, because of the enemy's anti-magic method, that We have tried many times before. This sorcerer obviously felt that this unconventional method of war was a little embarrassing. He knew that the Prime Minister in front of him was not a politician who only knew how to hide in a tower, but a strong man who had truly commanded a war between nations. Not feeling ashamed to ask, he asked in a low voice, "Prime Minister Rhodey, how do you think this war should be fought?" "Me? I have the right to give advice to the army, but the specific way to fight depends on how my general decides." Of course, Roddy would not reveal his plan now, and what he said was actually right. The real planning of the specific attack tactics was Sodeler. Since he had given the command to Sodeler, he would not interfere. Roddy knew the story of how Chiang Kai-shek's blind command led to chaos in the war. As a modern person, although he knew the general direction of the war, the specific execution had to be carried out by the frontline generals. If he interfered in everything, it would only delay things. Anderson blinked for a long time, not knowing how to answer for a while, because Lassman's fighting style had indeed exposed many problems. Roddy did not continue talking about this, and instead began to inspect the progress of the construction. The efficiency of the 5 high-ranked mages was far greater than any engineering team, and in less than a day, the outline of a huge runway had appeared in front of them. The mages relied on skilled spells, using magic to turn up the ground, then scattered it, mixed it with a certain amount of water and compacted it, and then used magic to solidify it. According to the level of the mages' magic, they could make the soil as hard as cement for a week. Anderson and the others had put in a lot of effort, and Roddy naturally would not mistreat them. Outside the Shadow Baby Dragon's cabin, there was also a lot of food and all kinds of clothes, and even cups and cutlery for daily use. At this time, Natha had already baked the bread and bacon, and even made a pot of meat soup, and placed it on the table that was condensed by earth elements. "Prime Minister, I have a question, but I'm not sure if I can ask. Is this place used as a drill ground? Or is it used to store those war machines?" Anderson used magic to condense a water ball to wash his hands. After cleaning himself up, he opened his mouth to ask. Roddy nodded happily. "You can say that. Because the things that are parked there are bigger, the space is more exaggerated. Everyone, you have worked hard. Come, let's eat first." He invited the mages to sit down, and then the 8 captives, Mag, and the others had dinner together. Although he did not use any magic to restrict her freedom, Mag obviously knew the power of high-ranked mages. From the beginning to the end, he only dared to look around anxiously, and did not dare to do anything else. "According to today's progress, how long will it take to finish?" "Another 3 days. Anderson obviously had a plan, but Roddy asked, "What about at night? Do we continue even when it's dark?" The other mages' faces darkened. They were not coolies. Although they had enough magic power, they could not stand standing here for a whole day. However, Anderson knew that this Prime Minister would not speak without thinking. After thinking for a while, he said in a low voice, "If we can take turns to rest, we should be able to meet your standards by noon the day after tomorrow. If it's possible, then please finish it as soon as possible." Roddy immediately said, "I solemnly promise that if you can finish it by noon the day after tomorrow, your salary will be tripled. At the same time, I will provide you with 30 standard recharging crystals and 1 kilogram of cobalt gold for free." Really? That's no problem." With such a profit motive, the mages suddenly felt that the work was not that heavy. It was just repetitive work anyway, they could just grit their teeth and do it. Roddy nodded with satisfaction, and then looked up at the stars above his head. Raxia City was just the first step of the whole attack. The land under their feet might be a place that Lassman would tremble in fear for in the future. Please remember this book's original domain name. The fastest website for mobile version, M. Chapter 1091. 3 days later, in the city of Duriel. The arrival and departure of Roddy did not have any impact on this bustling city. Most of the mages in the Parliament knew about this news, but they could not understand his whereabouts. Therefore, no one mentioned anything about him in the subsequent discussions. Jeremy seemed to have aged a few years since the reform plan of the Parliament was rejected. Now, when he presided over the discussion, he was much less talkative. At this time, he knocked the wooden hammer and said, "Regarding the attack to recapture Rashai City, you should have seen the information sent by the frontline commander, Lewis. Obviously, the enemy's defensive measures have some shortcomings. Therefore, Lewis has proposed the following attack methods." This showed the deceptive side of the Parliament. When the magic circle could transmit information from the front line in real time, the last bit of decision-making power of the commander was also given to the Parliament of Mages. That was to say, every major decision had to be voted by the members of the Parliament instead of the frontline commander. On Earth, there was a saying that, when a general is on the battlefield, he may not obey the orders of the Emperor. But in Lasman, it was completely the opposite. Although the mages in the room were extremely intelligent, they could easily understand how unreliable the decisions made by the Cloud Commander were. However, the previous battles in Lasman were always won by the mages, so this flaw had always been covered up. Until now, it was too late to change it. Now, looking at the bickering members of Parliament, Jeremy felt powerless. 1/3 of them did not even know what Rashai City looked like, but they talked so eloquently as if they were there themselves. A battle that would decide the life and death of tens of thousands of people was like a child's play to them. If there is no other way, let's wait for the army of the Kingdom of Karen to arrive. The people in Rashai City have not been massacred yet. We can recapture it when the time comes. Bullshit. Rashai City is so difficult to attack with only 2,000 enemies. Do you think the Kingdom of Karen is an ancient beast that can sweep everything in its path? The city wall is 7 meters high, and there are 3 layers inside and outside. Plus, there are anti-magic measures. How can you be so sure that you can take it? Do you think this is your backyard? But we... Beep! Before he could finish his sentence, a piercing alarm suddenly sounded in the council hall. All the mages were stunned for a moment and looked up at the same time. Is it an attack alarm? Damn it! Could it be that those fellows have attacked Duriel City? Idiot! Do you have any concept? The enemy's advance troops were still 500 kilometers away yesterday. How could they fly over without a sound? Speaker Jeremy, is this a false alarm? Or did something go wrong with the array? The representatives from the various academies regained their composure after a brief moment of panic. Jeremy remained silent with a frown on his face. He turned to the attendant who was running over from the door and said, "Calm down. Tell me what happened." The attendant's expression was indescribably blank. He stood in the middle of the hall and stammered that the alarm came from the watchtower by the sea. It said that everyone's expressions were tense, because the fear brought about by the primordial behemoth was not something that could dissipate in a few months. Discovered what? An unknown object is approaching from the sky. In the sky? Floating space tower? Dragons? Could it be some kind of magical beast migration? No, it's also possible. Wait, what's that sound? Jeremy waved his hand and the echoing alarm came to an abrupt stop. The noisy council hall fell silent for a few seconds as everyone heard a strange, buzzing sound coming from above. Jeremy did not say anything and began to walk out. The other representatives looked at each other and quickly followed him out of the council hall through the various exits. The buzzing sound made them raise their heads. There seemed to be a few black dots flying over from the distant sea. This is... Someone used a spell to observe and his expression changed. It's not a living thing, it's like a machine? Floating space tower? Impossible. There's no way a floating space tower can fly so fast. As the discussion went on, the black figure crossed the coastline and flew over Duriel City. The sound of the propellers was abnormally clear. The huge albatross transport plane was just a small black dot in everyone's eyes. Beside it, there were two reconnaissance planes guarding on both sides. The triangular formation of one big and two small brought an unimaginable impact to the mages below. Because it did not intend to land here, it was flying at an altitude of about 4,000 meters. The mages below had no idea how high this altitude was. Even if the mages of Lockman used the levitation spell or researched the floating space tower that could fly, no one had ever exceeded the altitude of 2,000 meters. Mr. President, we should use the defense circle of the floating space tower to stop them. A counselor reflexively said this, and the people around him immediately agreed with him. Lassman was the ruler of this continent, and it would be a disgrace to the mage country to allow such an unknown flying machine to fly over their heads. But Jeremy's face was full of shock. As one of the people who had the most knowledge about the kingdom of Karen, he immediately realized what had just flown over. Is there any news from Mithrin? He did not pay attention to the people's request to stop the aircraft and turned to the servant beside him. The servant was surprised and immediately went to ask. Not long after, he came back with a piece of paper. Mr. President, Ambassador Mithrin sent us a message this morning, but because of the meeting, she did not give it to me. Jeremy opened the paper with a serious face and saw Mithrin scribbling 3 paragraphs, the core of which was the news that the kingdom of Karen has begun to move. Because Hollier City was not far from the military airport of Par, when the plane took off yesterday afternoon, Jeremy and the other representatives heard the sound of the propellers. He thought it was just a routine training, so he did not take it seriously. But when he saw the newspaper in Hollier this morning, he realized that the kingdom of Karen had officially sent troops. Troops were dispatched. It was not a ship that needed to sail for a month, but a plane. Jeremy felt his head was buzzing, and the almost distorted handwriting made him feel the shock in Mithrin's heart. Mr. President, members of the Parliament, I don't know if this huge aircraft can successfully fly across the sea. The only thing I'm sure of is that when I heard the news, they should have been flying for about 8 hours. In other words, these planes had crossed the sea in less than 16 hours, which would take a month to sail. Please remember the original domain name of this book. The fastest website for mobile version, M. Chapter 1092. Mr. President, what's going on? Many of the counselors were still staring at the black dot in the distance, but more of them noticed Jeremy's strange behavior and gathered around him. That's the army of the kingdom of Karen. Jeremy answered truthfully, but he felt that his voice was extremely bitter. Prime Minister Roddy went to Raxia City to build a place for that thing to land. His words caused an uproar. The mages widened their eyes and looked at the white-haired president in disbelief. Jeremy, I hope you're joking. We should have stopped them and asked them carefully. Even if they signed the agreement, how could they fly over Duriel like that? It's flying at an altitude of more than 3,000 meters. Tell me, how can we stop it? Jeremy glanced at the counselor and said coldly, use the ballista on the floating space tower? Or do you think your fireball spell can catch up with that thing's flying speed? The counselors wanted to say something but stop. In the end, they all fell silent. All right, Ambassador Mithrin's letter proves that this is a friendly action. Prime Minister Roddy did not ask us to cooperate in advance. So, everyone return to the hall and continue our discussion. Jeremy's words were endlessly bleak, and his last sentence was even a little sarcastic. However, the heaviness and confinement of a system was not something that could be solved with a few sarcastic words. As his figure disappeared into the shadows of the porch, the counselors who followed behind him looked solemn. No matter how glorious Lassieman's victory was, the scene just now was like a head-on blow, waking them up from their dream of becoming a great nation that they were immersed in. In the city of Duriel, the people on the streets and alleys looked up at the sky. Initially, there was a stampede and panic caused by someone shouting, "The monster is coming," but the situation quickly calmed down after the city defense team intervened and the plane flew away. In the major academies, regardless of their strength, the mages were much calmer. The atmosphere in the Moffat Academy, which was mainly composed of puppeteers, was especially excited. They had a keen sense of smell when it came to mechanical objects. Even though it was far away, with just a short glimpse, it was enough to prove that the plane was a man-made aircraft through observation circles and calculation data. However, after hearing the commotion, Naifei walked out of the laboratory and frowned as he looked at the sky. No matter how he thought about it, something was wrong. She dropped the half-assembled parts in her hands and jumped onto a horse-drawn carriage in front of the academy. She flew all the way to Marinsula's laboratory, and before she even knocked on the door slowly opened. "You're here?" Sitting in an armchair by the window, Marinthra looked calm, but this was not normal for Naifei. In her memory, the Shadow Dragon was always busy, either studying magic arrays or writing something. When did it ever sit down and drink tea? "Sister Marinsura, I know what you want to ask. The aircraft that just flew past was the Kingdom of Karen's aircraft." Naifei's voice was a little excited. That Roddy, he has arrived?" They arrived a week ago." Marinsura was a little surprised. "You didn't know? He should have gone to find you." Naifei was stunned. She shook her head and said, "No." After a few seconds, she looked at the ground and pouted. "Maybe he's too busy." Of course, Marinsura could hear the grievance in Naifei's words. This little girl had been looking forward to seeing Roddy for a long time, but he didn't pay any attention to her at all. Of course, she was angry. But she also knew that Roddy was not that kind of person, so she said, "The day he came to find me, he went directly to Moffat Academy after leaving. I don't think he went to find someone else. Maybe there's some misunderstanding." As they were talking, someone knocked on the door again. Marinsura squinted her eyes. When the wooden door opened, it was Akasha who came in. She was a little surprised to see Naifei. After greeting the two of them, she immediately said, "Naifei's experiment is over? Roddy asked me to apologize to you when I see you. He went to find you that day, but he was stopped by your friends. They said not to disturb you, so he left temporarily." Naifei's grievances immediately vanished. She had been holding back her tears just now. Now that she heard Jiang Yi's words, she immediately understood that her friends had treated her as a suitor and had deliberately blocked her from entering. Of course, she couldn't blame them for this matter. After all, she had never accepted anyone's suitors before. Suddenly, her ears burned as if they had a fever. She said shyly, "Oh, I see." Marinsura glanced at her and then looked away. She said in a serious voice, "What's the matter with Roddy?" She had a strong aura and Akasha could also feel it. But she had always been indifferent to this kind of confrontation. She still smiled and said, "Because of the urgency of the war, Roddy has been staying in Laxia City. But he sent me a letter and asked me to ask you. The day after tomorrow, he will come to discuss with Lassman. At the same time, he will also bring a group of people to Laxia City. If you are interested, you can go with him." "Really? I just heard that the war in Laxia City is serious. Are we going there to help?" Akasha shrugged. "I don't know the specific arrangement. But when the time comes, I'll have to trouble you too. Can you come with me to take care of Sally?" The two looked at each other and nodded at the same time. On the other hand, Naifei didn't know that Sally was unwell, and she even enthusiastically wanted to see her. However, after listening to Akasha's explanation, she immediately sat back down obediently. The peaceful life in the academy had kept her away from the war. Naifei had never thought that such a thing would happen. For a moment, she was even at a loss. When will the war stop? At the same time, Sodeler, who had come down from the Albatross, had already come to the edge of the airport with his guards to report to Roddy. From the beginning, Roddy had trained the scouts according to his impression of the People's Liberation Army. Later, when the army expanded, Sottler implemented this strict military discipline to the end. As a result, when more than 100 soldiers on the Albatross disembarked and lined up, there was no chatter at all. There was only the sound of various kinds of equipment colliding and the trotting footsteps of the soldiers. Reporting to the Prime Minister, the Air Force Transport Company will carry out 25 transport batches according to the plan. There are a total of 3 transport planes taking turns to transport, and reconnaissance planes are escorting on the way. The first batch of engineering team and staff should be 133 people, and the actual number is 133 people, waiting for the Prime Minister's order. Everything according to the plan. You see the arrangement. I've done everything I can. Roddy looked serious, then turned sideways and signaled to go into the tent to talk about the rest of the matter. Although this kind of formulaic dialogue seemed meaningless, it was very necessary in the army. The soldiers not far away saw that their immediate superior was so serious, they did not dare to slack off. Look right, attention, orders came one after another. On the roughly flat drill ground on the side of the airport, in less than 10 minutes, neat rows of neat lines stood. End of this chapter. Chapter 1093. Although the first batch of engineers that arrived were not combat units, they were still an important force in the army. In the previous war against the Karen royal family, the role of the engineering company was obvious to all. Therefore, after the war ended, this independent company received an extremely high military budget for research and training. In other words, this was the team that had the least lack of money in the entire army system. Not only were the soldiers full of energy, but the solemn atmosphere of the various surveying tools that had been transported along with the plane also left the Lasman mages dumbfounded. As high-ranked mages, they had already been shocked by the suffocatingly huge plane. When the plane landed, they were so scared that they added several layers of shield. But now, looking at these resolute soldiers dressed in dark green military uniforms, Anderson had the strange illusion that they were mechanical puppets. In comparison, they were too embarrassed to call the Lockman soldiers that came to test the city regular army. "Mage Anderson, come here for a moment." Roddy's voice came from afar. Anderson shuddered and came back to his senses. He hurriedly walked towards the tent, and at the same time, he could not help but turn his head to observe carefully. The huge transport plane had moved to the side of the airport. The rotating propellers slowly stopped, and the technicians took out tools to check and maintain the plane. Meanwhile, the 2 small reconnaissance planes that had just been circling in the sky began to land on the empty runway. The smooth landing of the plane was full of confidence, and Anderson felt that his brain was a little numb from the countless shocks he had experienced. When he stepped into the tent, the first thing he heard was Sottler's words. "It is estimated that the second transport plane will arrive in 4 hours, and the special forces will arrive after the third batch. The reconnaissance planes will start their reconnaissance mission now." 3 days ago, the research department, led by Mage Kardashian, developed a new artillery shell specifically for siege use. Gulp. Anderson could not help but swallow his saliva. Roddy turned his head to look at them and said, "This is my army commander, Sottler. This is the high-ranked sorcerer Anderson from Lassie. They were the ones who assisted in the construction of Lasha Airport." After greeting each other, Sottler said, "The Kingdom of Karen's army will launch an attack today, but we haven't established contact with the Lasman army nearby. To prevent any mishaps, I hope you can help me communicate with them in advance." "That's not a problem, but I need to contact the council first." Before he could finish, Roddy interrupted, "There's no need to contact the Senate. Just inform the leader of that unit. I'm just informing you, not discussing a joint attack." His words were quite domineering, and he seemed to be looking down on Lasman's troops. Anderson stared blankly for a moment before coming to a realization. If he were to wait for the result of contacting the Parliament, he might not even be able to get a definite reply 3 days later. However, Anderson felt that Roddy's decision was unbelievable, but, "Are you going to attack La Scia City with only these soldiers?" After he said that, he noticed that Roddy and Sodeler were looking at him calmly. He immediately realized that he had misspoken and apologized with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry, it's just, you don't need to worry about these things, Mr. Anderson. We'll take care of it." Roddy politely sent him away, and then called Natha and Sodeler over to talk about the situation of La Scia City's defense. Although a lot of information had been reported on paper, Sodeler called 4 of his aides to ask about the vague details of the battle plan with their prepared notebooks. The characteristic of strength in numbers was undoubtedly revealed here. After each aide was responsible for a battle mission, the degree of detail in the use of information was far beyond Roddy's imagination. In order to avoid missing anything, he especially asked Mag, the Tuck captive, to come over to ask about it together to ensure that nothing went wrong. Sodeler's ability in dispatching troops was beyond doubt. The aides took out a map of La Scia City that had been precisely drawn, and began to fill in the new details in the tent. After the 2-hour meeting, Sodeler had a clear grasp of the structure of La Scia City's gate, the width of the streets, and even the composition of the enemy's core command center. Apart from seizing the city, I hope to capture the enemy's commander or deputy commander alive, and at least make sure to keep a bag of shards. You decide the specific action plan, and my baby Shadow Dragon can support the battle at any time. Sodeler saluted. "Yes, Prime Minister." The pre-battle meeting had finalized the battle goal, and Sodeler and his team of aides worked out the tactics on this basis. Finally, after Roddy signed it, it would become the final action plan. The arrival of the Albatross quickly made the temporary airport busy. Before dark, the engineering company had finished setting up the battle command center, and now the siege company had a very high proportion of sorcerers to help with the task. 3 sorcerers from the Kingdom of Karen had prepared magic circles in advance to cover the entire airport and the camp, so that the Tuck people in La Scia City could not see the lights and the landing planes. After the maintenance, the Albatross transport plane took off. With the senior rank sorcerers on board, Roddy did not have to worry about the plane crashing. As the 2nd and 3rd transport planes arrived one after another, the originally empty field was soon filled with mountains of supplies. This time, it was not troops, but weapons. Roddy looked at the boxes of numbered shells in front of him and felt inexplicably excited. The battle of conquering the Cullen Kingdom was the historical beginning of the brilliance of firearms. However, there were also many problems in the process of using them. It was said that war would rapidly upgrade weapons. At this moment, the cannonball in front of him and the artillery carriage that had yet to be assembled beside him were obviously a new generation of weapons that had evolved a lot. The transport plane could only carry a limited number of things at a time, and it could not fit the entire artillery carriage. Therefore, the large weapons had to be dismantled into parts and transported by magic, and then assembled and debugged by the accompanying artillery company. The cold barrel, the wheeled chassis, and the rows of mysterious magic circles were totally different from the ones Roddy had seen at the beginning. After the members of the Dragon Clan joined the research department, the optimization of the array was actually more effective than simply strengthening the material of the cannon barrel. When the first cannon carriage was assembled, Roddy was stunned to see the 5 pairs of wheels that had extremely strong off-road and load-carrying performance. He really could not confirm if this was a deliberate prank by Kardashian or if it was just a coincidence. Looking at the structure of the lower body, Roddy was inexplicably reminded of the legendary 59 modified tank. Please remember the original domain name of this book. The fastest website for mobile version, M. Chapter 1094. barrel calibration, angle calibration complete. Control panel adjustment complete. Load normal. Can be started. Amidst the rumbling sound, the cannon drove to the designated parking area not far away. Roddy looked carefully and confirmed that the heat dissipation array and the individual cannonball replacement device were new things he had never seen before. After becoming the Prime Minister, Roddy could no longer go through the numerous projects one by one. But since Kardashian approved the production, it meant that this thing was absolutely reliable. And the current war was actually more like a weapon testing ground for the army of the Kingdom of Karen. Not only the cannon, but also countless new weapons and equipment were waiting to be tested. Although it was inevitable that many people would have to be sacrificed, the army had to quickly evolve and transform in order to have a greater advantage in the future. Whether it was against other countries or enemies from other planes, Roddy's ultimate goal was to crush them with superior weapons. He looked up at the starry sky above his head and suddenly thought of a question. Could sorcerers launch satellites into the sky? With satellites there would be GPS. This way, whether it was on land, sea, or air, they could directly enter the information age when attacking the enemy. A reconnaissance plane streaked across the sky and flew past his field of vision. Roddy came back to his senses and felt that the satellite seemed a little too far away. The plane at the moment was still driven by propellers. It was still too early to talk about the satellite orbit level, but when he turned his head, he saw Sodeler walking over with a set of equipment. Prime Minister, this is a sample that the research department just gave us before they left. They said it can be used in the war. Looking at your face, you seem to be in a dilemma? Roddy rarely saw Sodeler with a constipated look. The latter did not hide it and said with a bitter smile, "At that time, I also wanted to try out as many new weapons as possible, so I agreed to all the requirements of the research department. But I didn't expect that they would approve more than 10 sets of this thing. But I don't quite know what it can be used for." The commander put the box the size of a school bag on the ground. Roddy could see a knob and something that looked like a phone on it. "First, tell me how to use this thing." It is said that within a range of 5 kilometers, people using this device can communicate with each other. F***CK? Roddy couldn't help but curse, giving Sodeler a fright. "What's wrong? Is this thing very powerful?" Sodeler didn't quite understand. He knocked on the metal cover and said, "This thing weighs about 30 kilograms. An ordinary soldier probably wouldn't be able to carry anything else while carrying it. Moreover, every time he used it, not only did he have to plug in the charging crystal, he also had to adjust the channel before he could communicate. If he didn't adjust it properly, he wouldn't be able to hear anything. If it's used in battle, it can indeed improve the coordination between the companies, but the negative effects are also very serious. No. This thing isn't just for squads." Roddy squatted and looked closer. Touching the walkie-talkie of the magic world, he couldn't have been more impressed by the research department led by Kardashian. "I didn't intend to interfere with your attack plan, but I'm guessing that the attack you came up with right now is still based on planned battle, isn't it?" "Yes. Everyone has been given a pocket watch that can accurately time the time. After we set off, we will attack strictly according to the battle plan, with the middle-level officers in charge." Sodeler answered quickly. Compared to the model of a Lord Knight and Squire charging separately, this was actually countless times better. It was more commonly seen in the previous world wars on Earth. Countless battles had proven the advanced nature of this method of warfare, but for a transmigrator, it was also clearly backward. In other words, after the battle begins, as the Supreme Commander, you actually can't continue to command the battle most of the time, right? Roddy's question hit the nail on the head, and Sodeler wasn't going to be stubborn. He readily admitted, "Apart from using specific signals, I really can't command the soldiers several kilometers away during the battle. That's why I've been focusing on the training of middle-level officers after the end of the National War, hoping that they can stay awake as much as possible after the battle begins and use their own judgment to ensure that the battle goes smoothly. That's the problem. No matter how well they train and learn, no one can guarantee that every judgment on the battlefield will be accurate, right? Roddy pointed at the square box in front of him. But if we have this thing, the companies will form a whole during the battle and can quickly know the situation on the battlefield, effectively expanding the range of information and avoiding making wrong judgments. And that's just the most superficial advantage. He gestured for Sodeler to follow. The two took a few steps to the side, just in time to see the huge cannon that had just been parked. You know the power of this thing better than I do. If I'm a scout at the front line and find an enemy camp hidden in the forest, I can instantly communicate with the artillery battery at the rear and give them the coordinates directly. If I can instantly communicate with the artillery battery at the rear and directly give them the coordinates, then there is no need for any battle plan at all. We can destroy this camp on the spot. Do you understand? Sodeler's eyes widened. Due to the limitations of history, most people in this world couldn't think of such a method of battle. Even in this commander's mind, artillery, engineering, army, and air force were all separate units that needed to be discussed and planned separately. They couldn't be mixed together, otherwise it would be a mess. But Roddy told him that if information could keep up, the entire process of the battle would no longer be planned in hours. Instead, new decisions could be made every second and carried out immediately. In fact, as someone who had been on the battlefield, Sodeler naturally knew the importance of information. But he had only thought of sharing information in small-scale battles and had never thought of cross-service applications. Then, this means that it's not just the artillery, but also the air force. Sodeler was stunned. That's what bombers are used for? The same goes for naval cannons and aircraft carriers. Roddy's answer opened Sodeler's mind to a whole new world. He couldn't help but breathe faster. But when he thought of the battle they were facing, he frowned. But I'm afraid this thing can't be used in the anti-magic area. The anti-magic area doesn't cover the whole city. We'll know the specifics after we try it. With that said, Sodeler knew that this was a good time to experiment. He immediately carried the huge walkie-talkie and left. He had a premonition that the Kowloon Kingdom's army would undergo earth-shattering changes because of this. A few kilometers away, the residents of La Xia City didn't feel anything. After the army led by the Thuk tribe occupied the city, although they did not start a massacre, they did collect food and civilian labor. Had it not been for the Thuk commander's achievements in defending the city, the 2,000 people would not have been able to hold the city for so long. On the surface there were 2,000 people fighting in the city, but there were more than 4,000 laborers in the city. Carts of supplies for defending the city were pushed to the bottom of the city wall. Commander Castley had generously given the laborers some food as compensation for the abundance of La Xia City, in order to suppress the potential civil unrest and riots. It turned out that the laborers were not that hostile. Most of them were grateful as long as they had food to eat. None of them had the slightest intention to overthrow the small number of enemies above their heads. No matter what the flag of the city changed, ordinary people were timid and cherished their lives. Whether it was a religious country or a mage country, it did not make much difference to them. Commander Castley was very satisfied. After today's inspection, she was about to go to the dormitory next to the command center to rest. But a buzzing sound came from above and stopped her. She went outside and looked up. There was a looming black shadow in the sky, with continuous noise hovering in her sight. She called her adjutant. "What's going on?" "General, this thing has been here for a long time. It will leave after a while. Maybe it's some kind of creature that we've never seen before? Could it be Lockman's puppet? I remember that some mages like to make these strange things." According to the intelligence, Those long-range catapults are probably the biggest war machines made by the puppeteers. As for those that can fly in the sky, I haven't heard of any other puppeteers except for the floating space tower. Although Casley's words eliminated Lockman's suspicion, she still felt that something was wrong. However, she had not encountered an attack from the sky after fighting for so long. After looking up for a while, Casley finally gave up thinking and specifically asked about the defensive situation of the city walls. Satisfied, she said, "Prepare a team to receive the reinforcements at the north gate. When they cross the river, those Lastman bastards will definitely cause trouble. Try to make sure they don't make it back alive." "Yes, General. Please remember the original domain name of this book. The fastest website for mobile version, M. Chapter 1095. The next morning, Anderson returned from the military camp of the Lassiman army more than 10 kilometers away. He had conveyed Sodeler's message to the commander, Valid, who was stationed 20 kilometers east of Rashai City and had 40,000 soldiers, had accepted it, but he was still skeptical. Obviously, if the Kingdom of Karen sent an army to such a large field, there would be a big commotion. However, other than a bunch of black shadows flying past, the sorcerer did not see any troops that he knew of. "So," he finally said, "I will send a troop to feint an attack to relieve the pressure on the Kalon Kingdom's army." This was the only thing he could do as the commander. After all, the feint mentioned by Valid was not to send troops to the city wall, but to send a team of cavalry to wander around outside the city wall. There would not be any losses. Any other actions that might cause losses had to be approved by the Parliament. Valid had long wanted to take down Rashai City as soon as possible. Even if the attack by the Kingdom of Karen failed, he could still whitewash the feint as a soldier's drill in his report. Therefore, this kind of flattery was a political investment with no loss. Anderson knew Valid's plan very well. But as a mage outside the military system, he despised Valid but also understood that Valid had no other choice. When he returned to the airport, he was thinking about how to report this matter to Roddy. But when he crossed the short slope, the mage almost thought he was lost. Overnight, the originally empty area on both sides of the airport was filled with countless tents. 2 huge self-propelled artillery vehicles were parked not far away. Transport planes that had just landed were unloading more supplies. At the same time, there were hundreds of well-equipped soldiers in formation. Sodeler was also among them. He was holding a square box and explaining something to them. Anderson frowned at the soldiers who had just arrived. He found it strange. The leaders were as strong as giants, but there were many thin and short people in the middle. It was a big contrast. When he was about to go closer, a lot of soldiers suddenly rushed in front of him. Anderson was startled because he was too focused on Sodeler and did not realize that there was an ambush in front of him. Now Anderson was frozen on the spot. Under the high slope where he was standing, there was a trench around the entire airport. It was obviously dug by magic to block the cavalry and build a line of defense. It was not a big project, but this kind of standardized measure obviously meant that the army had rich experience in field garrisons. The atmosphere of Valid's army was obviously different from here. Not to mention the trench, the tents were all over the place, and the ground was full of feces. It was completely incomparable to the order here. "Mage Anderson, please wait. You need to confirm your identity before you can go further." The soldier who spoke obviously knew him, but he still asked another wizard Lastman from the camp to come over and confirm his identity before allowing him to enter the area behind the trench. Anderson's footsteps tensed up when he saw the soldiers carrying out his orders so strictly. As he approached, he saw that there were even specialized toilets built in the barracks, and at the other end, there was even a canteen that was in charge of meals. Was this a military camp? Anderson, who had been looking left and right along the way, finally arrived in front of Sodeler. Only then did he realize how tall the giant in the team was. After reporting Vallard's words to Sodeler, the latter nodded and said, "From now on, Wizard Anderson, please wait in the camp and do not leave until the battle is over." Anderson, of course, understood that it was important to keep the information confidential. He nodded in agreement and followed the soldier to a tent in the barracks area. He found that although there were many tents, they were all empty. Just as he was wondering why this was happening, the transport planes that arrived one after another made him understand the reason. The first 2 batches of transport planes carried goods and cannon parts. The ones that arrived later were all carrying soldiers. Groups of soldiers trotted to the camp under the command of the sergeants. Anderson was dumbfounded by the uniform pace they were running at. This scene lasted until nightfall the next day. Anderson estimated that there were at most 1,800 soldiers near the airport. But just when he thought he would have to wait another 2 weeks, a whistle at 3 in the morning woke him up. He knew that the following battle would have nothing to do with him, but he could not help but put on his clothes and walk out of the tent to take a look. In the end, Anderson found that the soldiers in front of him were all equipped with armor and weapons. They surrounded the 2 activated cannons and set off into the distance. "Wizard Anderson, what's going on?" The other mages sat up from their beds in a daze and said with sleepy eyes, "Is the wind very strong outside?" "It's not the wind. It's them. They seem to be attacking the city." "This joke isn't funny. Attacking the city with just 1,000 people? Wouldn't it be a joke for Valard to lead 40,000 people and fight for so long?" Anderson swallowed his saliva. "Although I don't believe it, but they're all moving out at this time, surely they're not going to enjoy the scenery." As he spoke, the sound of the rotating propellers rang out. That familiar noise grew louder and louder, and then gradually faded into a buzzing sound that lingered above. Then came the second plane, the third plane. The few mages were silent. They did not know how to judge this battle because everything in front of them was beyond their understanding. Erwin, who was on the transport plane, did not know what these mages were thinking. He was talking to Teflin's platoon leader, Marzola, at the top of his voice. "When you land, you must protect it well. You must remember this." The last time he participated in the battle, Marzola was just an ordinary soldier. But because of his outstanding achievements and strong combat skills, he was now a qualified platoon leader, leading a team to carry out missions. "Yes, Captain, I will do it. Also, you're wearing your armor vest the wrong way around." "Ah!" Marzola quickly looked down, only to hear Erwin and the surrounding paratroopers laughing. "Just kidding! I see that you're always so nervous before a battle. That's not good. I'm the first batch of paratroopers after all." Marzola's expression was helpless, but he also laughed out loud. Paratroopers were not easy to become. At first, they only practiced parachuting from a height of 50 meters. Later, after the expansion of the army, everyone's training became stricter and stricter. In the last 3 months, there were even cases of soldiers being seriously injured or even killed during training. War was not a child's play. As the current trump card of the Kingdom of Karen, the paratroopers had the highest military budget, the most powerful weapons and equipment, and the best choice of soldiers. Those who were selected from thousands of soldiers were the best of the best. Of course, they were physically strong, and after countless selections, their mental strength was far stronger than that of ordinary soldiers. Therefore, in the face of the impending battle, these soldiers were not as nervous and stiff as new recruits. Instead, it was Erwin who slapped his armor and sang the military song. Gradually, hundreds of soldiers in the cabin began to sing along, until the ready light in the back of the cabin lit up. As the captain, he stopped, stood up and shouted, "Ready!" Everyone stood up and began to check their equipment. Chapter 1096. The soldiers took out the small rechargeable crystals from their pockets and inserted them into the grooves of the magic circle in front of their chests. Then they put on the protective cover. Different colored lights flashed on the backs of each squad of paratroopers, which meant that they were from different squads. Then, they put on goggles with night vision function. These gadgets may look inconspicuous, but they were all handmade magic tools in military factories, and the cost of each was calculated by gold coins. In other words, the construction cost of every paratrooper far exceeded the traditional definition of cavalry. It could be said that they were expensive. However, soldiers were trained for 1,000 days to be used for a single day. Only military achievements could prove their worth, and this group of paratroopers was very clear about this. Marzora put on the goggles and buckled the belt. After the squad leader confirmed that the equipment was working properly, the voice of "Ready" sounded. The red light went off, the hatch opened, and the green light came on. Erwin raised his arm and said, "Let's show these guys the elites of the Kingdom of Karen. Brothers, jump, jump, jump." More than 100 team members quickly leaped out and disappeared into the darkness of the night. The earth was still sleeping, but the outline of La Xia City was clearly visible in the vision of the night vision goggles. Erwin was the last one to jump down. The square walkie-talkie looked very small on him. After the floating magic circle came into effect, Erwin looked forward. This time, there were colorful lights flashing in the night sky. 3 transport planes dropped more than 300 parachute troops. The scene of them circling in the air and gradually flying into different groups was spectacular. But the sleeping people of La Xia City obviously did not know what it meant. The team of 200 people flashing red lights flew directly to the center of La Xia City under Erwin's leadership, while the green and white lights flew to both sides of the southern gate of the city. As the leader of the green lights, Marzora had found his landing position after circling 3 or 4 times. He was familiar with the map of La Xia City, but this time it was not a glide landing. Since many people hit the wall when they first landed in La Jena City, the parachutes had changed their landing method and used real parachutes in the later practice. When the altitude gradually dropped from 3,000 meters to 800 meters, the magic circle automatically triggered the parachute switch. White hemispherical parachutes opened instantly. The soldiers continued to control the small stabilizing wings on their bodies to ensure that they could reach the predetermined target area. These parachutes relied on physical means to increase the resistance, so they were not affected by the anti-magic area. Marsora's night vision was already very good, and after wearing the night vision goggles, he felt that it was as bright as day. He could see the clean streets of the city after the curfew, and he could also see the city guards who had discovered the abnormality in the sky and were running to report the news. But he was not in a hurry to attack. Instead, he led the parachute troops to an open space that was originally used for market trade. Before he landed, he looked to the south and vaguely saw 2 artillery vehicles had arrived at the predetermined location in the distance. Looking to the north, most of the red lights had landed in the center of the city. The enemy seemed to have noticed something. There were shouts coming from afar, but there was no alarm or loud alarm. Boom! As soon as his feet touched the ground, Marzora immediately reached out and pressed a button on his body. The backpack with the parachute directly fell to the ground. It was a single-use backpack. Marzora looked up and then gestured to the captains who had landed on the ground. There was no sound of conversation in the silent square, only the friction and collision of weapons and armors. Not long after, the team of 100 people was formed. The parachute troops were not only made up of barbarians and Teflons, but also many high-level and powerful human soldiers. There were more than 70 humans following Marzora. After they landed, none of them were injured. Their weapons included crossbows, short swords, daggers, and round shields. On the other hand, Teflons and barbarians had heavier weapons, ranging from battle axes to javelins. At the same time, they were also carrying crystal explosives, used to destroy fortifications. But at this time they did not immediately attack. Instead, all of them ran to another street and found a place to hide. If it was the previous battle style, Marzora would strictly follow the time on the pocket watch to carry out the attack plan. Their team would either arrive at the predetermined location within 5 minutes, or they would directly carry out the task of blasting something at the city gate. But now, the first thing everyone did was to find a predetermined street and hide behind a low wall. Then, they waited for Marzora to adjust the communication circle on his back. Turn on the power, confirm the indicator light, and turn the scale to 5. 5. Marzora recited the instructions. He found that after inserting the crystal, the signal indicator light of the device was flashing. This meant that the signal of the communication circle was not stable. He looked up and directly climbed up to the restaurant next to him. As he climbed higher, the signal finally began to stabilize. When Marzora jumped up to a balcony, the indicator light finally turned on. At this moment, a voice came from the receiver of the square. Marzora grabbed the receiver and shouted into the conical microphone, "The green team is in position. Over." Command received, over. The voice from the receiver surprised Marzora, because it was Sodalar speaking. Because the voice was so close, he suddenly had a strange feeling that Sodalar was personally commanding the scene. But soon, the other team's report came from the receiver. White team is in position, over. Red team is attacking, over. Artillery battery, 2 calibrated rounds will be fired in 10 seconds. The interval between the two vehicles is 5 seconds, over. Artillery battery received, loaded. 10 seconds countdown begins. Over. The series of voices made Marzora's eyes widen. Of course, he knew what it meant. As the commander, Sodalar was now in control of the movements of all the teams. Just as he was thinking, the 10 seconds countdown ended. Suddenly, a light lit up the dark horizon. The muffled sound was heard a few seconds later, but the shell had already flown 2 kilometers in the blink of an eye and smashed directly on the city wall of La Sia. Boom! Countless bricks and stone fragments were sent flying into the sky. 5 seconds later, the second shell landed on a street inside the city wall. Although there were no casualties, the silent city was completely awakened by the 2 shells. End of this chapter. Chapter 1097. Marzora now understood why the paratroopers had to find cover. If they were to stand near the city wall, they might even be bombed by their own people. Standing on the 3rd floor, he could clearly see where the 2 shells landed. At this time, a voice came from the communication circle, "Green team. Report the coordinates and adjust the data." The artillery team was 2 kilometers away. Even if it was daytime, they would not be able to see where the shells landed, let alone at night. But now, with the communication circle and Marzora, who was standing on the high ground, the work of adjusting the coordinates was directly handed over to him. When he took out the compass, Marzora could already hear a commotion coming from the barracks not far away from the city wall. It was the shouts of the soldiers inside after they woke up. Some people appeared in his field of vision with torches in their hands, but these people did not understand what was happening in the dark. They just kept shouting, not realizing what they were about to face. They had never seen artillery before, and did not know what a fixed-point attack was. One by one, the lights in the rooms were lit up. But because they did not expect the enemy to attack in the early hours of the morning, these people did not immediately come out of the barracks in such a hurry. Marzora compared the surrounding buildings and quickly calculated the distance of the shells in his heart. He then reported, "The first shell lands 20 meters north, 250 meters west." The second after the report, the artillery team responded, "Roger. The second round of shooting will begin in 10 seconds. Green team members, please take cover. Over." Green team, Roger. Marzora looked at the barracks a few blocks away. He knew very well that the enemy soldiers on the northern city wall added up to about 200 people. Other than the 200 to 300 elite Tuck people guarding the command center in the city, the rest of the miscellaneous troops were mostly in the 2 barracks in the inner city. And these people did not have much combat power. Within 10 seconds, not to mention running out of the barracks, half of them would probably still be lying in bed. The originally dark rooms in the city gradually lit up, and the noise in the barracks gradually grew louder. Finally, someone rang the alarm bell. However, as soon as the bell rang, 2 artillery shells exploded in the barracks. Boom! The improved artillery was much more powerful and accurate than before. The coordinates were adjusted once, and the shell landed right in the middle of the military camp. Moreover, this was no longer a simple calibrating shell, but an improved explosive shell. Because there was no anti-magic area in the military camp, the power of the shell was not reduced at all. The moment it exploded, a house was directly flipped over. Marthora only remembered that he had to take off his night vision goggles when the light shone. He knew it was too late, so he quickly closed his eyes. However, the shock wave that swept past him still made him feel fear. Crash! The glass in the surrounding houses shattered in an instant, and Marthora himself was blown back, but he immediately stabilized his body and said into the microphone, 2 hits. Over. Artillery, listen up. Continue firing. After another 5 shots, the barrel would cool down. Over. Artillery, Roger. Second shot in 10 seconds. Over. Red Team, report the situation. Hearing Soddler's voice, Irvin immediately replied, The Red Team has already taken over the command center's perimeter and is currently charging in. Over. Continue the attack. Over. As soon as Soddler's voice fell, another 2 shells landed in the military camp. The exploding light and burning flames devoured everything. The power of firearms was not something that a catapult could compare to. Before this, the biggest threat that the soldiers in the military camp could face was the group magic attack of Lastman's mages. Therefore, the priests had specially placed shards in the military camp to create an anti-magic area, to prevent the mages from attacking with fire. But now, the shells that landed after crossing the city walls directly blew away the roofs of all the buildings in the military camp. Even the soldiers hiding on the other side of the walls were killed on the spot by the violent tremors. The bombardment ended in 3 minutes. 12 shells landed in the military camp, and more than half of the buildings collapsed. There was no reinforced concrete in this era, and the shockwave alone was enough to blow down the not-so-sturdy load-bearing walls. After the entire military camp experienced this nightmarish attack, for a moment, no one thought of running out to fight. Instead, they only thought of running out to survive. Marzora involuntarily picked up his pocket watch and glanced at it. From the time he climbed up here to the end of the bombardment, it had only been 5 minutes. If it was in the past, the team he led would probably be preparing to fight the enemy. But now, Green Team, confirm the situation of the military camp. Make sure that the enemy's main force cannot reinforce the city walls. Over. Marzora immediately replied, The military camp area has been severely damaged. Green Team, immediately launch an attack. Over. White Team, report back. Over. White Team, in position. Marzora did not listen to the rest of the conversation. He directly jumped down from the 3rd floor and landed lightly on the ground. He waved his hand at the few captains who were on standby. Attack. From the outside to the inside, be careful of the collapsed buildings. Ignore those who have lost their combat power. Kill the enemies with weapons first. After saying that, the squad captains immediately led their respective teams out and quickly rushed along the 2 sides of the street to the military camp. Crossbows were strung, battle axes and swords were held in their hands. The charging barbarian soldiers were even ready to reach for the crystal bombs that were used for blasting. However, after turning the corner, a large area of ruins in front of them slowed down their charging pace. This military camp was originally the place where the soldiers of La Sia City lived. For Lasman's army, the army was the most worthless thing. They mainly relied on the honorable mages to fight at the front. Therefore, this military camp was very simple and compact. In other words, when it was hit by artillery, it was basically completely destroyed. What shocked the paratroopers the most was that the other buildings around the military camp were basically intact. Except for the shattered glass and wooden buildings that were blown down by the shockwave, most of the stone buildings were still standing in the same place. In contrast, the scene in the military camp was like hell. When the two squads of barbarian soldiers at the front arrived with battle axes in their hands, they found that they did not know who to attack. The ruins in front of them were full of broken limbs and debris. God knows how many soldiers were directly killed or buried under the debris of the buildings. Those who were lucky enough to survive were basically crawling on the ground with blood all over their bodies. The only thing they could do was to shout for help. Many of them were naked, not because they did not have time to put on clothes, but because they were torn into pieces by the impact just now. Chapter 1098. Marzola stood in front of the ruins. According to the information he got from Mag, there were about 1,200 people resting at night in this military camp. Some of the other soldiers were at the command center, and some were taking turns on the city wall. In other words, the bombardment just now had completely destroyed this military camp. Marzola thought it would be a head-on battle because they had 100 people, and the enemy had to have a few hundred people left. However, he didn't even have to transform now. After walking into the bloody military camp, there wasn't a single person standing up. This is the green team. The military camp has been breached. There's no resistance here. Over. Report the casualties. Green team. Green team has 0 casualties. Over. Marzola put away his knife and turned to the team leaders. Go and check if there are any officers alive. Keep those who can be saved alive. The higher-ups will ask questions later. Saved? The group of murderous Special Forces soldiers looked at each other. They jumped out of the plane and went through so much training, but in the end they were the medics? What else can we do? We can just give the last hit to those we can't save. Marzola was a little helpless too. A team leader at the side couldn't help but say, then, should we wait for the command center and see if we need to help the white team or the red team? As he said that, the sound of cannon fire rang out again. Everyone got a shock, afraid that the cannonball would land on their head. However, the loud sound from the city wall proved that the bombardment this time was aimed at the densely packed area of the city wall. The white team's voice came from the communication spell formation, and after the second round of bombardment was over 10 seconds later, the white team hurriedly shouted, "The enemy has been defeated! I repeat, the enemy on the city wall has been defeated. The white team has taken control of the northern city wall and the city gate." Marzola sighed. Forget it. I think we should try to save as many people as possible. Perhaps the officers are alive. It's better to earn some merit than to do nothing. These people's heads will probably belong to the artillery company. The captains were dejected. They turned around and ordered the soldiers to go and save them. Pay attention to your discipline. If you find a thuck woman, be careful. Many of their officers are women, but they are not weak at all. Also, don't forget the military rules. If you make a mistake, no one will save you. Yes, sir. Stepping on the broken wall, Marzola suddenly felt a little emotional. The enemy did not even have time to react before they were blasted into pieces by the artillery from a few kilometers away. Will the future wars always be like this? At the same time, Erwin, who had already rushed to the enemy's headquarters in the inner city, was not as emotional. Because the artillery could not support this place, the 200 paratroopers were still using their usual cold weapons. If there was no anti-magic field here, the paratroopers with crystal weapons would definitely end the battle in half an hour. But when the communications circle completely failed, Erwin knew that he had to fight the enemy head-on. La Xia City was originally built as a military fortress, so the whole city had 3 layers of walls from the outside to the inside. However, the second layer in the middle had been gradually dismantled due to expansion and a long period of peace over the past 100 years. Now it was basically the same as if it had never existed. On the other hand, the inner city wall was 10 meters tall. If they attacked from the outside, even if Erwin's team was 10 times larger, it would still be difficult. But the biggest advantage of the paratroopers was that they could choose where to land. So when the battle started, the 200 people directly appeared in the central square of the inner city. In the words of Band of Brothers, paratroopers were born to be surrounded. Of course, Erwin and the others were mentally prepared for this, but the enemies of this era had never thought that they would suddenly encounter an elite special force in the most heavily guarded place of the city. So in just a moment, the soldiers on duty nearby were killed on the spot. The scream woke Commander Casley up. She hurriedly got up with 6 priests and hundreds of Thuk guards. But in the dark, they were completely confused. Who was the enemy? How many were there? Where were they? At first, the Thuk guards wanted to rush to the inner city wall to fight, but as soon as they came out of their dormitories, more than a dozen of them were killed by crossbows. When they realized that the enemy was inside the city wall, Commander Casley had to quickly gather her troops and retreat to the only tower in the inner city. She had no other choice, because the soldiers living in different areas were separated by the paratroopers. They could not communicate with each other at all. Without a clear command from the commander, even if these soldiers could withstand the attack, it was difficult for them to form enough resistance. Sooner or later they would be killed or captured. Block the tower door. Go upstairs. Fight back from the window on the second floor. Send a distress signal outside. Damn it! How did the enemy enter the inner city? Casley shouted angrily. But at this time, the sound of bombardment kept coming. Everyone in the dark corridor was shocked. A priest said weakly, "Those people seem to have rushed downstairs. What are you waiting for? Block the way upstairs." Casley unsheathed her machete and led the 20 or so guards who were following her up the stairs. In fact, she still had some hope in her heart. Even if most of the soldiers in the city were made up of soldiers from various countries, it was impossible for them to be indifferent to the signal she sent out. But when she ran all the way to the top of the tower, she looked out of the window and found that there was no reinforcement army on the streets outside the inner city wall. Instead, the residents turned on their lights and looked around from the window. What the hell is going on? She did not even know who the enemy was. As a commander, the situation in front of her was not called a battle, but a sneak attack. Boom! Violent crashing sounds came from downstairs, and then the guards shouted in panic, "We can't hold on anymore. Are these enemies monsters? You have to hold on even if you can't." Casley's voice was a little hoarse. Standing on the top floor, in order to prevent the enemy from using magic attacks, the priests took out many bags of shards to create an anti-magic field. But the enemy's attack did not have any magic at all. Other than crossbows, javelins, or barbarian soldiers carrying wooden poles as battering rams, the power was shocking. The Tuk tribe guards were elites, but when they rushed up to fight in close combat, they found that the enemy was half the size of them. The thick steel armor was actually matte, and the swords could only leave a mark on it. But the enemy's huge battle axe that was almost the size of a child could kill or cripple them with a single touch. This was not a battle on the same level at all. Chapter 1099. Block the stairway, quick! The third team could not withstand the attack and had to retreat to the top floor. Cassie looked at the remaining 6 priests and 8 guards. Her hand holding the sword could not help but tremble. Bang! A figure flew up from downstairs, hit the wall above the stairway, and fell to the ground. Cassie could see that the soldier's chest was dented, and he was vomiting blood. It seemed that he could not be saved. The priest beside her hurriedly chanted a prayer. A faint light shrouded the soldier, and the situation seemed to be alleviated. But the enemy also rushed up from below. With the huge shield in front of them, the guards who wanted to attack had no way to attack. After 3 or 4 slashes, they only heard muffled sound. They could not even break the defense. Cassie was in a fighting stance, and the priests also released all kinds of divine spells. But as the 4 enemies steadily walked up from the stairway, none of them dared to attack for a while. The barbarian warrior with the shield was standing at the forefront. At this time, he had entered the state of berserk, and his armor was tight. The Teflon warriors on both sides did not even transform. The crossbows in their hands were pointed forward. A few seconds later, Erwin came up with his guards. He glanced at the front and said, "We are the airborne soldiers of the Kingdom of Karen. On behalf of Prime Minister Roddy, we ask you to surrender. Surrender unconditionally." Erwin was a pure soldier. He was skilled in the art of killing, but he could not remember this kind of genteel speech even if he had repeated it many times in the Lasman language. But the other side understood his words. Cassie was confused. Where? The Kingdom of Karen? She glanced at the priests beside her. One of them hurriedly explained, "Last time during the Crown of Twilight Autumn, there was such a country in the limelight. I think it's the country across the sea. I've only heard of it, but I don't know the details." "What are you doing here?" Cassie could not help but curse. But she also knew that the other side had rushed here, and naturally, they did not come to answer her question. And Erwin did not want to continue to talk nonsense with her. He shouted in an awkward accent, "Put down your weapons." The surrounding soldiers had lost their momentum, and slightly lowered their weapons. However, Cassie looked at the bags and wooden chests filled with fragments. Just as she was about to speak, she heard the priest beside her suddenly shout, "For His Majesty. No one is allowed to know the secret of the fragment." As Cassie stared in bewilderment, the priest seemed to have triggered some kind of spell at the same time. In less than 2 seconds their bodies began to tremble. Their muscles suddenly bulged, and their bones swelled and elongated. Horns grew out of their heads, and their fingers turned into claws. Cassie was so frightened that she took 2 steps back, but Erwin frowned when he saw this scene. He then said to his comrades beside him, "This time, we should have made a contribution." As soon as he said that, the 6 priestesses, who were about 1.9 meters tall, crawled forward like demons. Their robes were torn, and they fell to the ground after taking 2 steps. The other Tuk soldiers on both sides were stunned when they saw the scale-like skin on their bodies. For a moment they did not even have the courage to attack. Obviously, they did not know that the priestesses had the ability to transform before this. Facing these priests that were as ferocious as beasts, the 2 skinny Teflon warriors casually tossed aside their crossbows and reached their hands behind their backs, grabbing onto the 1-meter-long knuckles. The moment they stepped forward, they activated their transformation. Their bodies rapidly expanded to nearly 3 meters tall, and they raised their arms and swung them forward. Obviously, the anti-magic field could not stop this demonic transformation. Bang! The ferocious priestess had her chest pierced by the Teflon's sharp fists. The other priestesses who tried to attack Erwin were cut in half in midair. Watching the 2 giant Teflon warriors beating the priestesses like dogs, one of the Tuk soldiers finally could not bear the pressure. With a clang, he threw away his weapon and retreated. This action immediately caused a chain reaction, because after the transformation of the 2 Teflon warriors, the entire space on the top floor seemed to be compressed to half its original size. The other soldiers felt suffocated just by looking at them. Even if their weapons could cut through the armor, what damage could they do to those huge bodies? Casley watched the ferocious priestesses being torn into pieces. She completely lost her last bit of resistance. Erwin, who did not even use his berserk mode, walked forward, stepping on the blood on the ground. She looked at the scene in front of her, her heart full of unwillingness. Just one more day. Just one more day for the reinforcements. Erwin did not care what she said. He only repeated, "Put down your weapons." Casley took a deep breath and suddenly raised her scimitar, ready to slash at her neck. However, halfway through her action, she saw a soldier behind Erwin suddenly stretch out his arm towards her. Although they were still 7 or 8 meters apart, the soldier's limbs inexplicably stretched out and directly grabbed her wrist. With a forceful tug, she was caught off guard and the machete was flung away. The force was so great that Casley's right arm was dislocated on the spot. Before she could react, Erwin, who was in front of her, had already rushed over like a mountain. He raised his hand and grabbed her neck. With a bang, he fiercely pressed Casley against the wall. F***CK. Is it so hard for me to earn some military merits? Casley was completely stunned. Her back was numb, and her consciousness began to blur. While suffocating, she saw the scene outside the window. The city of Rashai was glowing with grayish-blue light before sunrise. From this angle, Casley saw the military camp area with black smoke, and half of it had collapsed. A large part of the city wall was blown up by the cannonballs in the distance. What the hell happened? Her head was full of questions. She only had time to say this sentence, and then she completely fainted. Tie them up and stuff their mouth. I don't want the Prime Minister to find people dead when he comes here. Erwin looked around. The other Tuk soldiers on both sides were less than 2 meters away from him. But at this time, no one dared to attack. They all raised their hands and waited for his judgment. Keep the prisoners alive. They are more valuable than dead. Of course, Erwin would not forget his mission. He squatted down and opened the wooden box. He carefully looked at the messy fragmented objects and asked, "Are those monsters still alive?" He turned his head and looked at the bloody scene. 2 Teflon soldiers dragged a priest who had lost an arm to him. The priest had completely lost his ability to resist. He looked up at Erwin like a pile of mud. Chapter 1100. Keep it for the Prime Minister. Keep a close eye on it. As soon as Erwin stood up, the Tuk priestess in front of him suddenly twitched in pain. Her mutated body slowly regained the appearance of a normal person, but then it deflated like a balloon. Her muscles and fat quickly dissolved, and she turned into a mummy. Erwin frowned at this scene, but he did not say anything. Keep it, keep it. By the way, move the fragments downstairs. I want to see if they can be used again. He removed the communication circle that he had been carrying on his back. As the soldiers moved the broken pieces, the anti-magic field disappeared as expected. The indicator light lit up, and the other teams immediately started talking. The artillery is ready to enter the city. White team, please check the city defense. Over. The city gate is open. The city wall is safe. Green team, please report the situation in the city. Over. The surviving enemies are no longer resisting. We have checked the streets from the barracks to the city gate. There are many civilians on the streets now. How do we solve this? Over. Sodeler's voice came over. Marzora, leave half of your men to continue searching the barrack. Then lead a team to ensure that the south gate is under control. Over. Green team, Roger. Over. Erwin picked up the microphone. Red team has completed all the tasks. Over. Well done. Sodeler's calm voice finally had a hint of excitement, but he quickly said, after we control the inner city, quickly send people to help control the north wall. We must not let anything happen to the north wall. Over. Erwin was a little puzzled. They had attacked from the south wall. Why did they pay so much attention to the north wall? However, this was not something he needed to think about. After skillfully arranging the teams, Irwin immediately led the team to the south wall. When the light of the sunrise finally illuminated the barracks, the 40,000 Rasman soldiers stationed in the east of Rashia City finally sounded the wake-up call. Wizard Valid yawned. He was quite particular about his lifestyle. Even if he lived in a simple tent, he still insisted on washing every day. At this time, he used a spell to condense a water ball to wash his face. When he was wiping his face, his subordinate hurriedly came to report. "Commander, there's movement in Rashia City." "I know there was an unusual movement. Everyone could hear it just now," Valid replied without even putting down the towel. "It's mainly because the scouts at the front just reported that the gate of Rashia City is open." Valid froze. "What do you mean? Is that Thuk bitch trying to lure us into attacking them? It seems like the army of the kingdom of Karen has entered." "Can you King complete your sentence? What is going on?" Feeling somewhat irritated, Valid threw the towel away and grabbed the collar of the soldier. "There are less than 2,000 soldiers in the kingdom of Karen. Is the scout blind or did he hit his head on a rock?" "Commander, I don't believe it either. But the scout said that the south gate of Rashia City was indeed open. He took the risk to take a closer look and found that the flag on the gate had been changed. At the same time, the strange puppet of the kingdom of Karen had also entered the city. But the enemy's defenders didn't show up. The scout didn't know what was going on, so he hurried back to report." Valard stared at him for a full 5 seconds before letting go. Then continued the investigation. For a moment, he could not figure out what was going on. He turned his head and glanced at the catapults not far away. These devices were the improved versions of the Moffat Academy, far from the crude ones in the past. Because of their precision, it took a lot of time and effort to repair and replace the parts before each use. Fortunately, the attack range of these things was very long. When it was launched, it could even reach a range of 2 kilometers, so the enemies on Rashia City could only passively take the hit. Of course, the catapults could not be accurate at this distance. When Valid woke up, he was still thinking about how he was going to make contact with the army of the Kalan kingdom. However, the sudden turn of events inexplicably gave him an ominous premonition. He raised his head and saw a small reconnaissance plane hovering in the sky descending towards the airport. The huge transport plane was nowhere to be seen. Before he could think further, a scout in leather armor was directly brought to him. The scout was sweating and his voice was trembling. "Commander, Rashia City has been captured by the kingdom of Karen." Valard stood there in a daze. After a long time, he asked, "How did they do it?" "I don't know. But when I went there, the soldiers on the gate asked me for my identity. After I told them, they asked me to inform you that the enemy's reinforcements are approaching. In order to prevent the city from falling again, please lead the troops into the city as soon as possible and strengthen the defense of the city wall." Valard raised his hand and rubbed his face hard. After a while, he said in a weak voice, "Let's go. Let's move out and enter the city." Although he did not understand how the army of the kingdom of Karen could capture the city overnight, the fact was in front of him. He could not deny it even if he wanted to. After the military order was passed down, there was a sudden uproar in the surroundings. The shouts of the sergeants rose and fell one after another. It was a big project for a camp of 40,000 people, and it would take at least 2 or 3 hours for all of them to start moving. 20 kilometers did not sound too far, but it was estimated that it would take the afternoon for all of them to enter the city. At 9 o'clock, the council hall of Duriel City was sparsely filled with councillors. Speaker Jeremy held the news he had just received and announced to everyone that Rashia City has been captured with a complicated expression. The counselors who were whispering and discussing what to eat for lunch suddenly became quiet. After a long time, someone said, "Speaker Jeremy, did you make this joke because the atmosphere is too heavy?" Ha ha. His dry laughter gradually stopped because of the dead silence around him. The army of the Kingdom of Karen that arrived in advance has gained control of Rashia City. The enemy's commander is General Casley of the Tuk tribe, and he has been captured. Wizard Valord obtained the first-hand information through the scouts. He just sent a message saying that more than half of the enemy's troops in the city have been killed, and the rest are basically injured. The surroundings were still quiet. It was not that the counselors did not have any questions, but they had too many questions. They did not know where to start. In the summary of the meeting they had just received, they were even discussing the issue of, if Rashia City could not be conquered within 3 months, should they choose to retreat strategically? After the city was lost, the news from Valord made the counselors feel that the city was simply unbreakable. But how long had it been? So, what's wrong with Valord? Has he been complying in the dark all this time? Damn it! How dare he try to deceive the council? Hurry up and read the latest update. Download address. Chapter 1101. When you're blaming Vorod, have you ever thought about why we didn't suspect this when we received the information from other channels? Facing all kinds of comments, Speaker Jeremy's eyes were calm. He continued, in fact, Wizard Vorod did not deliberately fail to conquer Rashia City. The information he reported has been verified from all sides. However, the fact that the Kingdom of Karen seized control of the city within 3 days is also a fact that we need to face. Everyone, we're all mages. When we were still apprentices, trying to learn our first spell, who would first suspect that another mage was cheating after seeing another mage use a forbidden spell? I think most people would be wondering when they would be able to reach such a level. That's what we're seeing. Others did it easily, but our troops didn't. Is it difficult to think about how to catch up? Why aren't you thinking about how powerful the Kingdom of Karen's army is, but why are you questioning why Wizard Vorod is not as powerful as the enemy? Isn't there something wrong with the direction of our discussion? Jeremy's tone was calm, but the content of his words made the arguing mages sit back down. After all, these people were not pure politicians. Since they had received the influence of the magic system, they were also high-level spellcasters. Although there were often disagreements among the academies, they were all smart. No matter how stupid they were, they knew that the right to speak in a country was largely determined by its military power. In the past, they had an amazing number of mage groups, and they were always successful on the battlefield. However, when they suddenly encountered such a sudden blow, their first reaction was to refuse to believe the truth. They were used to being the leader, and now they were suddenly kicked down to be the second. This kind of psychological gap was not something they could accept immediately. Jeremy didn't say anything else, but his body wasn't as straight as usual. Instead, he slouched down on his chair. The counselors were silent for a long time. Finally, a counselor from Moffat Academy spoke, "So, do we need to change the topic temporarily? According to the current rules of discussion, we can't." This time, the rigid rules of discussion finally put all the counselors on fire. The sudden change of the war in front of them made them all feel as if their hearts were on fire. However, now they had to bite the bullet and continue to discuss unimportant things. Then, I suggest that the motion to amend the meeting system should be put back on the agenda so that we can respond to the current war and that crisis as soon as possible. Mr. Speaker, is that all right? Sure, but we need to quickly discuss the issues that have already been arranged. The Anda province's conscription system has been strongly opposed by the locals, so Jeremy was like a robot, emotionlessly presiding over the meeting. However, the more he acted this way, the more tormented the counselors beneath him felt. Everyone understood that this chairman's anger would always be displayed in this type of restrained manner. He rarely flared up at anyone, but the anger behind his back was clearly felt by everyone. Meanwhile, Marinsura and Naifei had no idea what had happened this morning. The two of them were in the baby dragon's cabin, looking down at the land under the first rays of dawn. Although they remained silent, they were thinking about completely different things. Marinsura hadn't experienced such a feeling of flying for a long time. After losing the dragon crystal, she focused on the inheritance of the elementalist, and quickly improved to this level. Although the power of her magic couldn't be compared to when she was a giant dragon, the feeling of forging a new path made her extremely satisfied and even filled her with fighting spirit. Looking at the land under her that was constantly retreating, Marinsura narrowed her eyes and felt an itch that she hadn't felt for a long time. After concentrating on studying magic for so long, she hadn't experienced a real battle for a long time. Now that the war was imminent, she finally had a chance to show off her skills in front of Roddy. Although she did not say it out loud, she did try to tell Roddy what kind of situation she had fallen into. Of course, Marinsura didn't think about why she had such a thought. Clack! The sound of metal clashing made Marinsura turn around. She thought that there was a problem with the cabin's seal, so she turned around anxiously. However, after looking around, she realized that it was caused by the collision of parts in Naifei's hands. "What are you doing?" "I am fine. I just haven't finished some things, so I want to finish the link before we arrive." She didn't come empty-handed. Instead, she brought along some heavy parts. Actually, Naifei had been in seclusion for so long, so she didn't just mess around in the laboratory. After almost 2 years of studying, she had made great progress in the field of puppet making. Now, the puppets that Naifei made were no longer homework from her teacher. Instead, they were cutting-edge puppets that she could often publish independent papers on the optimization of various magic arrays and mechanisms. The existence of the charged crystal could be said to be an energy revolution, and the status of the entire Moffat Academy had soared in recent days. Because the puppet system was finally no longer limited by the huge cooling mechanism, after reducing the size of the puppet system, whether it was war machines or other fields that were previously out of reach, they all developed rapidly. And now, the thing that Naifei was assembling was the core of a puppet. If her teacher was here, he would probably be amazed by the exquisite structure and design. But obviously, Naifei had never publicized any information about this part of the design. Her latest energy core was probably 3 generations ahead of Lassman's current large-scale war puppets like the catapult. "Pack up your things. Be careful not to lose them when we land." I got it. By the way, Sister Marinsura, what do you think of Sister Sally's condition?" Naifei asked as she stared at Marinsura's face, trying to catch the slightest change in her expression. However, Marinsura didn't answer. Instead, she replied calmly, "You should know better than me what's going on." Naifei didn't say anything. Marinsura knew that Naifei had the ability to visualize all elements and even all kinds of energy. This was a talent that couldn't be possessed by an ordinary person. Therefore, whether it was puppet making or physical observation, Naifei had a far greater amount of information than an ordinary person. Naifei had indeed seen the lingering purplish-black aura on Sally's body, and she could also tell that Sally's life force was constantly weakening. If it weren't for the exuberant green light wrapping around Sally, she would have been dead a long time ago. Naifei raised her head and looked at the cabin next to hers. Akasha and Sally were sitting there. Naifei and Akasha didn't talk to each other after a simple greeting before they set off. When she thought about the situation of Akasha and Akasha, she felt that it was unreal. 4 years ago, she was still in Mogra village, but now, she was on the battlefield with the current monarch of the kingdom of Karen. Suddenly, Naifei felt the baby shadow dragon was descending. She couldn't help but feel nervous. However, since she had fastened her seatbelt, She and Merlin Sarah didn't leave their seat. However, when she saw the scene in front of her, Naife was stunned. A huge city was getting closer and closer. Chapter 1102. Is this Lasya City? Marinsura was also puzzled. She had better eyesight, so she could see the destroyed barracks and the frost wolf flag on the city wall. Is the battle over? As she spoke, the baby dragon began to hover at a low altitude and quickly found the largest square in the city. It flapped its wings and landed steadily at the edge of the square. 2 hatches opened, and Marinsura squinted her eyes as she walked out. She saw a group of soldiers closing their parachutes at the edge of the square. The heavily armed guards protected the area. Many civilians peeked out from the windows, but when they realized that there was a dragon lying on the square, they quickly shrank back into their houses. After a few seconds, they carefully poked their heads out again. Marinsura unfastened her seatbelt and turned around. She saw Roddy helping Sally down the special gangway in front of another cockpit. The fragile monarch of the Kingdom of Karen was wearing a low-key cloak. She held the Prime Minister's hand as they walked down the ground. After that, Roddy turned around and walked to where Marinsura was. However, the shadow dragon had already jumped down. She asked calmly, "Is it over?" Attacking the city is not difficult, but defending the city is the difficult part. Seeing her cold expression, Roddy quickly replied, "The enemy's reinforcements have arrived at the other side of the river. That's why I rushed to attack the city. Fortunately, I was lucky enough to take it down." When Roddy turned around, he saw Naife appearing at the cabin door. He was about to say something, but when he opened his mouth, he froze. That was because the little girl in his impression had undergone a tremendous change. From her temperament to her appearance, she was now very similar to the girl who sat on the grass in Mogra village and chatted with him before he transmigrated. She was wearing a red dress, and her long hair was fluttering in the wind. This scene made Roddy feel like his brain had stopped working. Countless words that he had prepared were stuck in his throat, and he even felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Ah, Naife, you've grown a lot taller." Before she could finish her words, Naife opened her arms and jumped down. Seeing that she was jumping toward him, Roddy quickly raised his hands to catch her. Her soft body was in his arms, and her faint body fragrance was exactly the same as in his memory. She punched Roddy's back with her soft fist. "You're a big liar. You lied to me about everything." Roddy realized that she had grown up. He stiffly tried to put Naife down. However, Naife held him tightly and did not let go. She continued, "Don't lie to me anymore, okay?" Roddy was puzzled about what he had lied to her, but he couldn't refuse Naife's request. Okay, I'll never lie to you." "Well, let's get down first." Naife reluctantly let go of him, but when she landed on the ground, she was still very close to him. She carefully looked at Roddy's face and found that his face was full of stubble, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Obviously, he didn't sleep well. She quickly put away her willfulness and said in a low voice, "I thought I was going to participate in the battle. I was so nervous. But when I came here, I found that the battle was over." "Well, of course, I won't let you participate in the battle. This time, you just need to stay in a safe place and watch. I heard that you've studied a lot of puppets. If you have the chance, you can experiment on the battlefield. It will help you improve your ability." Turning around, Roddy looked at Marinsula in the distance and said, "It's a bit rushed, and the war hasn't stopped yet. Although the city has been conquered, the main force of the Kingdom of Karen hasn't arrived yet. Now we can only rely on Lasman's troops to enter the city to help defend. But after they enter the city, the order will be a bit messy, so I want to arrange for you to rest in the inner city for a while." "I don't care." Marinsula paused for a moment and then said, "You go and take care of the king. I can walk around by myself. Don't worry about my safety." Roddy pulled his hair anxiously and said, I don't need to command the battle now, so I have a lot of free time. After I settle down, I will stay with you. You don't need to tell me that. You can arrange it yourself. Although Marinsula didn't reply, her tone was a bit softer. Roddy let out a sigh of relief. Then he arranged for someone to take out the things in the cabin, and then led them to the carriage to the inner city. Akasha helped Sally hold the Viper's Kiss. Sally chatted with Naifi and Marinsula for a while in the carriage, but it was obvious that she was in a bad state. When they arrived in the inner city, she went straight to the room arranged for her to rest. Roddy asked Akasha to stay in the room, and he came out with a worried face. Then he took Marinsula and Naifi to their respective rooms. Perhaps Marinsula sensed his uneasiness. She said in a low voice, "Of course I'm not here to enjoy the scenery. If you need any help, just let me know. I do have something to discuss with you, about the gods and the anti-magic area." Roddy said a few words, and Marinsula's expression finally became serious. She waved her hand and said, "Then let's go and have a look." She left quickly. Roddy looked back at Naifi's room, and the latter happened to poke her head out of the window. She hesitated and asked, "Can I go too?" Thinking of her ability, Roddy nodded immediately. "Let's go." "Ha ha!" Naifi immediately ran out of the room with joy. She turned back and closed the door, following closely behind Roddy. The sun gradually rose. The troops of the Kingdom of Karen had entered the city from the north gate. The artillery slowly passed through the central street, all the way to the south gate. Half of the engineering company was left to maintain the airport, and the rest followed the artillery company into the city. They immediately rushed to the south city wall and began to modify and strengthen it. Standing here and overlooking the south, below the 8-meter-high city wall, there was a flat plain as far as the eye could see. After about 2 kilometers, there were 2 kilometers of pebbles and mudflats, and a wide freshwater river called Lamu River. The area in front of the city was one of the most suitable crossings for Lamu River. The river was not flowing slowly, and the width of the whole river was more than 100 meters, and the depth of the river was more than 20 meters. This was the dry season. If it was the flood season, the width of the river would be more than double. In addition to the area in front of them, the terrain on the east and west sides was also uneven. Pedestrians could barely walk, but carriages or other vehicles could hardly pass. Therefore, for a long time, Lasha City had been the main passage and pass between the Lockman Kingdom and other countries on the other side of the river. Chapter 1103. The morning mist shrouded the earth. Because the trade had stopped, no one could be seen on the road from the city gate to the ferry. However, there were a lot of wild animals running back and forth faintly. After the morning mist dissipated, they could see the teams that had gathered on the other side of the river. At this time, they had begun to use boats to transport soldiers and supplies back and forth. Looking into the distance, this army actually stretched for more than a few kilometers, and their equipment and clothing were all different. Some formations were scattered, some were neat, but at the moment it seemed that there was a basic order. The width of the ferry port was only more than 100 meters. Under the command of the Thuk clan soldiers in dark red armor, the troops of all kinds staggered onto the boat. There was no sense of tension at all. In the command post in the middle of this army, the scepter priest, Eudora in a white robe, was frowning and looking forward. She was far less relaxed than those soldiers. She was about 1.7 meters tall. Compared with General Casley, who was stationed in the city, she was thin and had no muscles at all. After all, the generals and priests in the Thuk tribe were almost two extremes. The generals were all strong women with bulging muscles, while the priests were mostly skinnier, and in comparison, they were more attractive. Eudora was the commander of the current complicated army, and she was also one of the 3 people with the highest position in this action of Esker. In a religious country, all the rulers also had important clerical identities. Not to mention the king of Esker, the monarch was also the only existence with God-given monarchical power. Eudora's mother was one of the 12 high priests, and she was the most powerful person in the current younger generation of the Laochi family. If they could win this war steadily, they would definitely enter the decision-making level of the 12 high priests in the future. This kind of new generation leader was far more knowledgeable and cultivated than others, and also more cautious. At this moment, Eudora was anxiously waiting for the news from Rassia City. Kasley would send people to report the situation in the city and the information of the enemy 3 times a day. However, the soldiers who should have arrived before dawn did not come until noon. They haven't arrived yet. There might be a problem in the city. Eudora let out a sigh and turned around to ask her aides in the tent. Tuk tribe was mainly composed of women, so more than half of them were slender women. However, they didn't talk about clothes or makeup skills here. Instead, they were holding parchments in their hands and making all kinds of decisions for the entire army of 40,000 people. Hearing Eudora's question, an advisor nearby immediately said, "The scouts in front have finished crossing the river. At present, 500 of our people have crossed the river, and there are 2 infantries from Jik country and Tessi country. The cavalry of Bindu country is more troublesome to transport. Their camels are transported slowly by boat. Then let the scouts quickly go to the city to investigate. Remember to tell them to be careful. Even if the city gates are open, don't let them in." The anxiety in Eudora's heart is getting stronger and stronger. However, the defense of Lasya city is impregnable. It is impossible for Lasman and his men to attack it in just a few days. Kasley's previous report to him could be said to be full of confidence. She had never mentioned the possibility of losing. Even if there was an attack, they should be able to see black smoke rising from the city walls at this distance. But everything was so quiet, until the sound of horses' hooves suddenly sounded in the distance. Damn it, it's Lasman's cavalry. Eudora saw the blue flag that only Lasman's army used from afar. Her movement at this time shouldn't have been discovered, because last night, Kasley sent a message saying that Lasman's army was still stationed 20 kilometers away. Seeing that there were only about 200 people in this team, Eudora didn't panic too much. Instead, she immediately ordered the army that had crossed the river to form a formation to fight. The number of Lasman's cavalry had always been very small because the local horses were very short and not suitable for cavalry. Only nomadic tribes like Bindu in the south had enough war horses and camels to charge. Therefore, it was not a problem for the team that had been on the shore for 2 hours to deal with the cavalry. As she expected, the miscellaneous army of Tuk tribe in the front of the team, after barely forming a formation, the 200 cavalrymen who rushed to the front lost the courage to attack. They could only choose to take a detour at the last moment. They used a few fireball spell scrolls which were not very powerful as a test from a distance. Obviously, there was the same fragment in the formation to ensure the existence of the anti-magic field. The fireball only blew away 5 or 6 soldiers who were holding shields and wearing shell-like armor at the edge of the formation. The rest of the fireballs that fell in the formation were instantly extinguished and did not cause any damage at all. Seeing this situation, this group of cavalrymen immediately went to Lasya city without looking back, leaving a cloud of smoke behind. Eudora squinted at the scene on the other side of the river and had a general judgment in her mind. The scouts who came back also reported the news. Kasley's garrison in Lasya city had disappeared, and there were soldiers in strange clothes on the city wall, but not many of them. The Lasman army in the distance seemed to have just started moving toward Lasya city. The troops were long and scattered. The cavalrymen who had just arrived were from these troops. With their speed, how long will it take for all of them to enter the city? Eudora immediately realized the problem and turned her head to ask the advisors. After these advisors who were proficient in calculations carefully asked the scouts for more details, they gave an answer in less than 2 to 3 minutes. Lord Priest, their entire army of 40,000 people will only be able to completely enter the city at around sunset. However, if the first batch of mobile troops were to speed up, they would be able to arrive 2 hours before sunset. Taking a look at the map of Lasya City, Eudora immediately ordered, "Speed up the troops crossing the river immediately. I want to see 3,000 troops ready to attack the city before noon. From now on, transport the cavalry troops first." As soon as the military order was given, the advisors immediately began to discuss and formulate a plan to achieve the plan as soon as possible. After Eudora confirmed it, she left a mark on the parchment with her divine power and quickly passed it on, but compared with the order in the command tent, the troops outside were obviously more chaotic. Fortunately, these advisors' orders were very targeted. Even in such chaos, the troops that were named quickly jumped the queue to the front of the river crossing port and began to quickly march to the other side of the river. Chapter 1104. Because Rhodey did not come to the inner city to interfere with Sodeler's plan, Sodeler and his aides were the ones making the decisions. While the Prime Minister was studying the problem of the anti-magic field, Sodeler was discussing with his aides the placement of the artillery on the city's defense map. The reason why they attacked the city in the early hours of the morning with 2 artillery carriages and paratroopers was that the reconnaissance aircraft had confirmed the enemy's movements in advance. They had to take down the city before the enemy's main force of more than 40,000 reinforcements. Although they had seized control of the city, the battle was far from over. For the paratroopers, it was easier to attack the city than to defend it. That was because the total number of soldiers transported from the Kowloon Kingdom by air was less than 2,000. There were only 2 artillery carriages. Excluding the engineering company and some orderlies, there were only 1,200 people who could enter the city and participate in the defense of the city walls. Although the artillery carriages could deal a fatal blow to the enemy from a distance, the anti-magic field would inevitably affect the power of the crystal shells. At the same time, the 2 artillery carriages could not be used indefinitely. If they were placed on the city wall, they would still be in danger of being destroyed by the enemy. With all these factors combined, the safest way was to let the Lasman army that had been besieging the city quickly enter the city to assist in the defense. There was nothing wrong with Sodeler's decision. After the reconnaissance aircraft confirmed that the enemy had begun to cross the river, he even suggested to Varud that he should quickly disrupt the enemy with his cavalry. Even if they could not cause much damage, they should constantly attack and disturb the enemy, so that they would be tired of forming their formation, so that they could delay the enemy crossing the river. However, at noon, he learned from the report that Varud's 200 cavalrymen had retreated after circling the enemy's scattered troops. "Are these people's brains stuffed with sh*t? Sodeler, who was usually good-tempered, could not help but curse. He found that perhaps his soldiers were too well educated. After such a long time, they had forgotten what the generals and soldiers of this era were like. As a remote echo of the Parliament, Vallard might have a sufficient understanding of war itself, but after not having the power to make decisions for a long time, he no longer had the boldness that a general should have. Not mentioning the importance of information gaps and time gaps in war, the complicated and lengthy discussion system of the Parliament made it impossible for Vallard to act at his own discretion. Although the horses of his cavalry were not strong, there were still 800 of them. Even if he sent 600 of them to attack the ferry, they would not even need to use any fireballs or anything like that. They would be able to send the other side into a long period of chaos. However, in order to avoid any criticism from the Parliament, this coward had only sent 200 men. What could 200 people do? Sightseeing? Although there were many enemies at the ferry, Any war could not be calculated by simple addition and subtraction of numbers. Sodeler had confirmed through the information reported by the reconnaissance plane that this seemingly large army was actually a patchwork of various small countries. They were all armies in name, but in reality, more than half of the troops were abnormally scattered. They could not even do basic things like setting up camp, let alone fight against cavalry on the battlefield. In the end, such a good opportunity had been given up by Overlord. Sodeler gritted his teeth. If not for the fact that the transport planes were not yet in scale, I would not have to suffer this vexation. The battlefield was ever-changing, and he could only continue to make decisions based on the current situation. But he had lost the initiative, and now the initiative on the battlefield was gradually slipping towards the other side. Sodeler sat in an armchair and stared at the sand table in deep thought. Not long after, news from the reconnaissance plane was transmitted to the room through the magic circle. 2,000 enemies have completed their preparations and are already riding towards Lasman's troops. Looks like they're just a motley crew, Sodeler mumbled, and then immediately made a decision. Close the city gate. Don't mount the cannons on the city walls for now. At the same time, pass the news to Overlord and tell him to prepare for the attack. Meanwhile, in a stone house in the inner city, Roddy was carefully examining the fragments in front of him with Marinsura and Naife. At the same time, there were a few shriveled corpses of the priests in the house, as well as the captured commander, Castley. The materials are not uniform. There are wood, stones, and even charcoal and metal. Marinsura reached out to fiddle with the fragments of different shapes in the box. She took one out and narrowed her eyes as she said, "This should be the decorative patterns on the building. This mark should be caused by rain or some kind of water flow. It looks like it has been used for many years." Her rich knowledge naturally came in handy at this moment. In contrast, Roddy naturally did not have such experience. He chose to ask Castley directly, "Did Isika ally with these small countries to counterattack and invade the Lasman kingdom?" Of course, Castley was not as cowardly as Mag. She was tied up tightly by the guards, and had an unyielding expression on her face. She did not answer a word to Roddy's question. Roddy did not care about that at all. After the ambush by the paratroopers, the other party did not even have time to destroy those letters in the command center. The dead and injured soldiers were all miscellaneous troops. The Tuk tribe troops who were really in charge were mostly in the inner city. When Irwin and the rest rushed in, they did not kill too many people before the battle ended. The remaining officers and soldiers all chose to surrender in the end. Hence, if he wanted to ask anything, he just had to ask those officers first. He noticed that the other party had advanced to the 15th tier, which was not considered low on this continent. It was obvious that he was also an outstanding person. However, the other party was not a clergyman, but a pure warrior. The only 6 priests in the whole team who could use magic or divine spells had all died mysteriously after transforming in the battle. This made Roddy feel a little strange. Especially those priests' corpses, it made Roddy even more certain of his initial judgment. The Tuk tribe had to be in cahoots with the demons, because their mutation was very similar to Teflin's, and they were not affected by the anti-magic domain at the same time. However, the clues made Roddy even more curious. Where did the Tuk tribe, who were related to the demons, find these fragments? Prime Minister, there is a new result from the interrogation. A soldier greeted at the door. Roddy waved. Just say it. According to the information provided by the prisoners, the fragments were transported from Isika's capital. They said, the priests received His Majesty's gift in front of the Maglar temple. After he said that, Roddy's mission bar lit up again. Please remember this book's domain name. Writing Pen Chinese Network Mobile Version Website. Literature Proficiency. Chapter 1105. Got it. Follow? Dream? Calm, he didn't rush to look at it. He turned to look at Castley, and realized that the latter still had a disdainful expression. Did you think that the reinforcements would be here soon, and that we wouldn't be able to defend the city? Why, you know? Damn it. Mag, that fellow. She immediately thought that the missing Mag had leaked the information, but Roddy calmly said, I also know that they are crossing the river now. The whole army is very complicated, and there are a total of 40,000 of them, right? Castley's expression finally changed, but she didn't seem to want to give up. She lowered her voice and said, Lady Eudora will not let you off. I will not let them off either. Roddy walked up to this Thuk commander, and realized that she was taller than him. Her shoulders were wider than his, and she was stronger than the average barbarian woman. He thought for a while and asked, I am just curious. What is the purpose of your expedition to Lockman? Even if we take down Lockman City, it won't be so easy to continue to the north. Although Lockman has a lot of mages, the army isn't just for show. After they get used to the way of battle, I don't think a ragtag army like yours will have any advantage. Either your majesty still has a trump card that she hasn't used, or her motive isn't to invade the land, take over the resources, or restore Icica's former glory. Castley smirked. With the anti-magic domain brought by the shard, these mages in Lockman are even weaker than ordinary people. Without their biggest support, it's only a matter of time before they are destroyed by Her Majesty's army. Then I shall wait and see. Roddy was expressionless. He waved for the soldiers to bring her to the prison. Roddy would not casually kill this kind of commander-level prisoner of war. There were too many mysteries surrounding the Thuk tribe. Although Roddy's army had already clashed with the Thuk tribe, from the information he had, the vanguard was just a group of test subjects. The ragtag army led by Castley was able to take down this city because the structural problems of Lockman's army were completely exposed under the anti-magic domain. To put it bluntly, both sides were rookies. It was just a competition to see who was more rookies. Being able to take down this city was probably a pleasant surprise for Icica. Otherwise, why would the reinforcements take so long? All the clues made Roddy feel that this method was familiar. With the memories of the High Elves' war against the demons in his mind, coupled with the fact that he had personally fought the demons a few times, he had a better understanding of this race. The more he understood the demons, the more he realized that they could not be thought of using common sense. It was just like how the poor thought that the Emperor also used a golden shoulder pole, or how many aliens in sci-fi works had 4 legs and 1 head, and even talked about friendship and love with humans. At this moment, whether it was Castley or the mages of Lassiman, they could not imagine what the species that had always been hiding in the shadows wanted to do. The demons' way of war was completely different from humans and even the High Elves. Roddy now suspected that this war was part of the demons' plan to invade the realm, and the crux was these shards and the ruler of Icica. After Castley was taken away, just when Roddy wanted to ask Naife what she had found, a new notification popped up in the Save the Thuk Tribe quest series. Looking at the word completed, Roddy clicked on it. The words showed that he had received another 120,000 experience points. At the same time, the quest window was updated. You've traced the source of the shards, and the Thuk tribe's military campaign does not seem to have a simple goal. All of this is obviously related to the preachers. Find a preacher and try to find more clues. From this step onward, the quest goal finally changed. It said, capture a Thuk preacher alive. 0 to 1 inch. The quest rewards were also getting richer. It showed that the reward was a staff used by preachers. Roddy looked at the attributes and realized that it was more of a one-time use item than a staff. Grip of Terran Attack 56-88 Single Hand plus 95 Intelligence plus 60 Spirit Equip. User has a better vision in the fog. Use. Cast Great Dispel Level 17 Effect. Dispel the negative status of all units within a 15-meter radius with divine power. Usage 1. Whether it was Rose Cross or Viper Cross, or even other religions, they all seemed to have the same name as Great Dispel, and the effects were more or less the same. However, compared to a low-level divine spell like Dispel, the effect of a high-level Great Dispel was obviously much better. As for the level 17 Great Dispel reward, even with Roddy's experience, he had never heard of such a thing before. He suddenly wondered if the reward could dispel Sally's negative status, but he dismissed the thought after 2 seconds. Sally's status was not cursed or poisoned. It was caused by the damage of divine power. It was not something that could be dispelled by a simple divine spell. Even though this reward couldn't be used to solve Sally's problem, it was still a good tool. Roddy had never thought of completing the whole series of quests, but it seemed that it was close to the route he was searching for clues. Since he was going to face the rest of the Tuck Tribe's team soon, he might as well capture a living priest and interrogate him. With that in mind, he looked up and saw a small flame dancing slowly in Merlinsera's palm. Roddy was stunned at first, then he looked at the large, forbidden symbol on his status bar and exclaimed, "You can cast spells here?" The flame in her palm was not red and yellow like Roddy remembered. Instead, it was a few shades of white. The outer flame was silver, and the inner flame was bright yellow. "I can't use normal elemental spells, but what I'm using now is elements from the elemental plane." Merlinsera squinted at the flame in her palm. "It seems that this so-called anti-magic field is not as powerful as I thought." Even so, Roddy's shock was still written on his face. He did not expect that this anti-magic field did not completely prohibit all magic. Putting aside what it meant for Merlinsera to be able to cast spells in the anti-magic field, just the difference in elemental properties alone was enough for him to study. He immediately ran to find the elemental summoning stone that he had learned as his second main profession, but he found that it could not be used at all. In other words, this also proved that the anti-magic field was limited. It could only prohibit the elements of this plane, but not the elements of other planes. Chapter 1106. Merlinsera was confused. "What's wrong? Did something bad happen?" "It's just a guess, but it hasn't been confirmed yet." Roddy thought for a moment and organized his thoughts. He then continued, "I was just thinking that the Tuck Tribe only managed to take down Lockman City with the anti-magic field because they caught him by surprise. If both sides can't use spells and return to fighting with cold weapons, the Tuck Tribe might not be able to gain much of an advantage. Even if the priests can transform, they won't be able to do much. After all, they won't be that strong after transforming." Then, he pointed at Merlinsera's palm. "But what if the Tuck Tribe's army has a spell holder like you? If Lockman can't cast spells, but the Tuck Tribe's army can, how are they going to fight this battle?" Hearing this, Merlinsera frowned. However, Roddy waved his hand and said, "All of this is just a guess. Now that we know, we have to think of a way to defend against it. But this move of yours is really impressive. Solomon's legacy is indeed not as simple as we thought." Hearing their conversation, Nephi suddenly asked, "If this anti-magic field can only block spells from this plane, why can I still see the light on these things?" This time, Roddy and Merlinsera looked at her at the same time. Then, they looked at each other for a few seconds and asked almost at the same time, "Who is your father?" They asked this because Camilla was an arcanist who had mastered the High Elves' spell system. Obviously, arcanists couldn't avoid the anti-magic field. The only possibility was that Nephi's father had a special identity that allowed her to inherit some talent that didn't belong to this plane. Element visualization wasn't a talent that could be found everywhere. At least, Merlinsera had never heard of anyone who could maintain this ability. Some spells could allow the caster to see the rhythm of the elements, but it couldn't allow the caster to see them all the time. Naife looked around and blinked her eyes. I've said it before. Ever since I could remember, my mother had never told me about my father. I don't even know his name. In fact, I didn't know that every child has a father until I was 7 years old. In the past, Roddy only thought that she didn't remember things, but now it was obvious that there was a problem. However, if Roddy went to Elson City and asked her questions like, "Where did your husband go?" he felt that he would definitely be beaten up. Such doubts could only be buried in the bottom of his heart, but Roddy was more curious about how much Naife's ability was affected. "Can you cast other spells?" "Something else." Naife raised her hand and tried to gather magic power, but nothing happened. She stuck out her tongue and said, "I really can't gather any elements. Sister Merlinsera is the best." Roddy glanced at Marinsula. Even though the latter's expression was calm, he still complimented, "This is indeed very impressive." At least for now, if you were to challenge most of the wizards in this realm with these shards, you would definitely win. It's not bad. You were the one who told me to learn this. Now it seems that I made the right choice. Merlinsera finally smiled, but she had always been cold, so the smile soon disappeared. "It seems that I need to learn how to summon creatures from the elemental plane from you." Roddy thought that although his element summoner level had increased a little, he still hadn't learned cross-plane elemental summoning. The elemental creatures in this realm were already very powerful after they were gathered. He didn't know if the summoned creatures from the elemental plane could be more powerful. In the past, Roddy couldn't find a way to do it, but now that Merlinsera had found the knack of it, she should be able to help him a lot. So, he asked directly, "If you have time, can you teach me? I don't know anything about summoning, but if it's just studying the elemental plane, I can give you some reference." The corner of Merlinsera's mouth unconsciously curled up again. Roddy immediately agreed. "Okay, I'll go check on the enemy's reinforcements now. If you're tired, you can rest for a while." "I'm not tired. I'll go with you, okay?" Naife immediately shouted. Roddy glanced at Merlinsera, who shrugged. "To the city wall? I'll go have a look too." When the three of them arrived at the southern city wall, they discovered that the cannon carriages weren't moved to the top of the city wall to defend against the enemy. Instead, they were placed on the passage below. At the same time, on the open plain in front of them, they could see a small army detouring around the area in front of them and heading towards the east side of the city wall. On the other side, Wizard Valid, who had just broken camp not long ago, was leading an army of 40,000 people towards the city. Although they had the help of a sound amplification spell, it was still very difficult to ensure that the army of 40,000 people did not cause any trouble while moving. Fortunately, Valid had a solid foundation in this aspect. After a series of orders were passed down in an orderly manner, the army began to march towards Lasha City in batches. However, they hadn't gone far when Valid received an urgent message from Lasha City on horseback. It showed that the local reinforcements had finished crossing the river and were quickly detouring around Lasha City to attack his army that had just broken camp not long ago. It was very rare for Valid to receive this news in advance, because he didn't expect the enemy to be so bold as to directly detour around the city to attack his army. Either the enemy knew that there would be no reinforcements coming out of the city, or they were extremely confident in their cavalry's ability. 40,000 people sounded like a lot, but in war, numbers were never the deciding factor. When the cavalry attacked a vulnerable position when they were defenseless, the losses would definitely not be small. If some of them fled, the impact on the morale of the army would be unimaginable. Valid was familiar with history, so he knew that Lockman had relied on the magic troops to achieve a miraculous battle in which 3,000 people defeated 30,000 people. He didn't want to become a negative example in history. At this time, Valad's vanguard troops had opened up a distance of nearly a kilometer from the engineers who were dragging the supply wagons and siege vehicles. Even if he wanted to gather the troops into a bucket formation, he couldn't do it. He had to immediately order the front, middle, and rear troops to stop at the same time and shrink into 3 groups, trying their best to form a formation. At the same time, he quickly transferred 800 cavalrymen to the middle army as a mobile support team. The others worked hard to equip their ordnance and prepare for the cavalry's attack. From the time the order was given to the troops to start executing, it took 15 minutes. By the time the chaotic soldiers got into position, the enemy cavalry had already formed a black line and was pressing towards them from afar, so fast. Chapter 1107. Since the start of the war, Valard had never faced the enemy head-on on the plains. He had been defending the city, and attacking the city from the start. In fact, he did not even have the chance to face the cavalry before, because the cavalry in front of him were the elites of the southern Bindu kingdom, and had never appeared near Rashai city before. They were riding tall horses with high endurance, and their running speed was far faster than Lassiman's cavalry. Formation. Hurry up. Prepare the spells. Prepare the bows and arrows. Valard glanced at the battle formation on his side and immediately frowned. Because the front and middle army were combat units, their orders were very thorough, and the formation was still neat. But the engineers in the back, who were responsible for transporting the catapults and other parts of the army, were far inferior to the other soldiers. After they hurriedly picked up their weapons and formed a formation, the formation was obviously a little messy. Ambushing cavalry on the open plains, they either had to form a solid barrel formation and passively wait for the enemy to rush up, or take the initiative to send their own cavalry to meet the enemy. Although the losses would definitely not be small, at least the decision was in their own hands. Valard, of course, understood this. He was currently in the middle army, and looked at the enemy in front of him who had stopped to adjust, and estimated in his heart how to deal with it. At a glance, there were about 2,000 of these cavalry. They were wearing typical nomadic ornaments, but it could be seen that they were wearing some different styles of armor. Valard used magic to identify and could confirm that the style of these guys' helmets was the type that could only be made by the craftsmen of Eska. In other words, the foundation of this army was the Bindu Kingdom's cavalry, but after the support of Eska's military equipment, their combat power was probably much stronger than expected. He only had 800 cavalry under him, and their combat power was not comparable to the enemy at all. If they took the initiative to attack, they would probably be defeated in a single encounter, but to just wait passively like this, Valard's indecisiveness was acting up again. This sudden encounter simply did not give him enough time to pass the information to the council to make a decision. According to the authority given to him by the council, the only thing Valard could do at this moment was to seek stability and not be reckless. The so-called stability, in Valard's eyes, was defense. In his opinion, the 2,000 cavalry faced an army of 40,000. It was not certain whether they would dare to charge. If the enemy charged, it was very likely that they would fall into a formation battle, and if they could not charge out, it was possible that they would all die here. Therefore, he calmly decided to defend. At this time, the morale of the army was still good, and many of the soldiers were equipped with bows and arrows. The mages also began to use magic to quickly dig a temporary trench in front of the camp. It seemed that they were not afraid of the enemy's attack at all. Time ticked by just like that. 2,000 cavalrymen stood a kilometer away and rested for a short while. They took better care of their horses than Lassiman's cavalrymen. The difference could be seen just from the lustrous hair on the horses. Originally, the knights of the Bindu kingdom wore leather armor to fight, but now they were all wearing light armor and helmets protected by iron sheet. Although they were far from the standards of heavy cavalry, Their defensive capabilities and impact force were clearly much stronger than before. The horses had been running for a long time, so they should have been exhausted. However, there were also mages among the cavalrymen. They were wearing bird feather cloaks, but they were not druids or mages. Instead, they were more like shamans of a primitive religion. Similar to the orc shamans of the Nehemiah Plains, they used some very crude and primitive spells. These spells weren't very powerful, but they could quickly restore the horse's stamina. Valid saw that they purposely let some of the cavalrymen walk in front of the army, while the shamans cast spells at the back. Obviously, they were trying to avoid part of the anti-magic field. In less than 5 or 6 minutes, the entire team had completed their adjustment. Amidst the shouts, they began a tentative attack on Lasman's army. The entire cavalry was divided into 3 groups, and they approached Lassiman's army from 3 directions. Their horsemanship was excellent, and they didn't directly choose a position for a frontal charge. Often, after charging, they would start circling around the army of 40,000, approaching and distancing themselves from time to time, obviously looking for weaknesses in the 3 groups. Of course, Valid wouldn't just stand there and watch. The archers in the army launched a group shot, but the cavalrymen were proficient in moving within range, and were almost unaffected. Unsurprisingly, the spells used by the mages were annihilated above the cavalry. These cavalrymen were obviously fearless, and didn't fear any spells at all. At this time, there was the buzzing sound of propellers in the sky, but none of the cavalrymen raised their heads to look. They were already used to the existence of these things when they were on the other side of the river, and now they only had their minds on dealing with Lassiman's army in front of them. After cruising back and forth for more than 10 minutes, one of the groups of about 500 began to accelerate without warning, suddenly approaching the rear of the army, and launched the first attack. Valid's expression turned ugly, because he realized that the enemy had already seen his weakest point. But now he had no choice but to immediately order the archers to shoot. But when the battle formation stretched for a kilometer, there were only 2,000 archers who could provide support in this direction. The 2 volleys of arrows they had shot in a hurry had indeed caused the deaths and injuries of dozens of cavalrymen, but these knights of Bindu, who were riding on war horses, rushed over at a speed far faster than they had imagined. After easily crossing the sparse trenches, they forcefully crashed into the army formation. The momentum of this fearless charge was astonishing. Because the war horses and the armored cavalrymen weighed more than half a ton, the logisticians with shields and spears were not strong enough to defend, and countless people were sent flying on the spot. Although they gritted their teeth and held on under the roars of the supervisors, their basic skills in the battle formation were not good enough. In front of the most powerful knights of Bindu, they could not withstand a single swing of their scimitars, and were often split apart along with their shields. The 4 rows of spearmen at the front were trampled flat like paper, and the knights behind them crushed them with a rumble, easily stabbing their scimitars into the army formation made up of more than 10,000 people. The group of 500 was unusually small compared to the huge army formation, but the knights of Bindu did not mind at all. They roared and slashed all the soldiers in front of them into pieces. The soldiers in the middle of the army formation did not hold spears in the first place. They only had swords in their hands at the last moment. Facing the cavalrymen who were more than a meter taller than them, they had no idea how to stop them at all. In other words, these soldiers should not have participated in the front line on the battlefield, but the current situation had forced them to do something beyond their abilities. Even if there were a few strong supervisors mixed in, they could not change the fact that the overall strength of the rear army was weak. Chapter 1108. Some of them wailed and turned to flee, only to be chopped down by the supervising troops. They roared for the soldiers to maintain their formation, but when they turned their heads, they found that the other 2 cavalry units that had been patrolling on the periphery had already charged towards them like sharks that had smelled blood. One of the 800-men unit charged straight into the battle line that had been torn apart, while the other unit remained on the periphery, obviously keeping an eye on the movements of the other two military units. In the process of liberating the country, the Rasman Mage Assembly had naturally fought with the Thuk religious cavalry. However, there were more than 5 ways to restrain the cavalry, and none of them could be done without the help of the mages. At this moment, the mages in the middle and front troops watched as the cavalry charged in and slaughtered the rear troop. They were all agitated, they wanted to rush forward to help, but without the command from their commanding officer, they would be beheaded by the supervising troops if they moved. Ballard looked at the scene before him. In fact, there was no other way. The most effective, magic support, was ineffective, and bows and arrows could not be used after the enemy charged into the formation. If he mobilized the cavalry to rescue them now, they would immediately be intercepted by the remaining enemy unit. So, after some thought, he could only order the middle troops that he was in to maintain their formation and press forward step by step towards the rear troops, so as to force the cavalry to retreat from the battlefield. If the other party insisted on fighting, then they would definitely have to stay here. At this time, there was no way to let a single unit go to rescue them alone, because once they left the formation, the other mobile cavalry unit would immediately come to intercept them. The cavalry commander on the other side was bold but careful. Even in the face of an army of tens of thousands, he still dared to take the initiative to attack. It was obvious that he had absolute confidence in the strength of his men. And just as the formation moved forward by 30 meters, more than 1,000 of the Bindu cavalry had already pierced through the frail formation of the rear troops. If it was the middle troops or the front troops, just the high-density formation alone would be enough to block the cavalry halfway and then overturn them. But more than 70% of the logisticians did not have this ability at all. At the front of the battle formation, they could still barely maintain a dense formation. However, when they reached the middle section, their formation became sparse. Their first reaction when they saw the cavalry charging over was to run away. Therefore, they were slaughtered to their heart's content by the scimitars wielding Bindu cavalry. Ballard's face was gloomy. The biggest reason for this scene was that he had hurriedly sent his troops into the city after hearing that Rasha city had been taken, so the logisticians did not have enough protection. But it could not be helped. If he had surrounded the soldiers and the catapults in the middle, it would be hard to say whether they could enter the city at night. Now that he had to bear the consequences with a huge number of casualties, Ballard did not have the mood to regret. He just wanted to make the cavalry stay here and make the enemy pay the price in blood. However, those cavalrymen were obviously not hotheads who were blinded by bloodlust. When the bugle horn sounded by their leader, they didn't show any hesitation to continue fighting. After cutting through the formation, they immediately left. Among them, those who were skilled in horsemanship even stood firmly on their saddles. They turned around and made an insulting gesture towards Valad's central army. The combat power of the cavalry was to say. The rear troops of the 10,000 strong in the rear troops were to stand. To say. But, in other words, they basically didn't fight back. After the Bindo kingdom's cavalry succeeded and left, they did not even bother to confront the central army that had moved over. Instead, they turned around and charged at the edge of the rear army. Their terrifying stamina far exceeded that of Lassaman's cavalry. The logisticians who had lost their fighting spirit could no longer maintain their previously solid line of defense. When they saw the cavalry charging at them, they all retreated cowardly, which made it even easier for the cavalry to kill. Ballard even let the mages beside him try to cast spells for long-range rescue. But looking at the annihilation of the elements, his face darkened. The cavalry were like sharks swimming in the deep sea. Every time they opened their mouth, they tore off a piece of meat from their prey. The 3 troops cooperated well, and even took turns to rest. Only when the center troops rushed over to cover the rear troops did the exhausted cavalry turn their horses around and leave. The distance between the two sides was more than 400 meters. Arrows could not reach them, spells were useless, and the 800 cavalrymen in his hands did not dare to use them. From start to finish, Overlord had been hacked to death by the enemy, but he still did not have the courage to take the initiative to attack the enemy. Don't be reckless, that was the only thought in his head. But the enemy obviously did not intend to leave. They stopped at a distance and even began to drink and rest the horses under the eyes of Lassieman's army. If they did not leave, Overlord would not dare to move his army. Now he truly understood what it meant to be skillful and bold. There were only less than 2,000 cavalrymen, but they forced his main force of more than 18,000 soldiers to stay still. It sounded ridiculous, but Lassieman's army really could not do anything to the enemy. The infantry could not keep up, and they could not surround the enemy. Even if they wanted to leave, they had to bear the risk of being attacked at any time. If there was another opening, the morale of the army would collapse completely. Overlord glanced at the silent Lasha city. The enemy had made full use of the cavalry's advantage on the plain. At the same time, he had confirmed one thing: Lasha city could not spare any troops to support the enemy. They could only watch from the beginning to the end. To put it bluntly, it was like a bison being bitten by a hyena. No matter how strong the bison was, it could not move in pain. Overlord was burning with anxiety. If he chose to stop the army completely, then Lasha city would not get any reinforcements. Without enough soldiers to climb up the city walls to defend, what awaited Lasha city would be another fall. He could afford to lose soldiers, but he could not afford to lose Lasha city again. However, just when the mage was in a terrible fix and was even considering whether to let the cavalry take a gamble, the familiar sound of propellers rang in the sky again. Overlord raised his head to take a look. The small Falcon reconnaissance aircraft was flying towards him, but unlike in the past, the speed of the aircraft this time was a little slower. At the same time, a cover at the bottom of the cabin was opened inexplicably. It seemed that the pilot had forgotten to close it, so it just flew over with its mouth wide open. The Bindu cavalry still did not take the plane seriously. At this time, their 3 troops were resting about 500 meters away from the edge of Overlord's army. The horses were eating grass and drinking water, and the soldiers were eating jerky that they brought with them. Their presumptuous laughter was louder than the sound of the propellers. Please remember the original domain name of this book. The fastest website for mobile version, M. Chapter 1109. However, this time, the reconnaissance plane did not circle around and leave. Instead, it began to dive straight down from a height of 1,000 meters, and then flew over at a low altitude of about 100 meters. Before this, no reconnaissance plane had ever flown at such a height. The Bindu Kingdom's knights, who did not take it seriously at first, finally noticed the abnormality, but they just raised their heads and pointed at the sky. They did not dodge or fight. Overlord frowned at this scene, feeling that something was not right. Just as he was thinking, the plane flew over the cavalry, and suddenly, a black object leaked out from the cabin. It fell silently, swaying, and smashed straight into the position of the Bindu Kingdom's cavalry. Then, nothing happened. The metal bomb was inserted into the ground in front of the cavalry, splashing up a handful of soil. The cavalry, who were still a little panicked, looked at the exquisite metal block, looked at each other for a few seconds, and then laughed. What did this mean? Overlord looked at the reconnaissance plane that had flown far away, full of doubts. He vaguely felt that the thing that fell on the ground might not be as simple as he thought. The reconnaissance plane returned less than 10 minutes after it disappeared. This time, the Bindu Kingdom's cavalry knew that it was going to use the same trick again. One by one, they jumped on their horses and waited for the plane to swoop over so that they could dodge the metal block thrown down. But this time, the reconnaissance plane did not swoop, but chose to fly over the troops in a more stable way, and at the same time, its flying speed was much slower than before. Another black object was thrown out from the cabin. The wind-stabilizing tail made the swaying bomb gradually fall headfirst, and with the help of inertia, it fell towards the cavalry's formation. But this time, it did not plunge headfirst into the ground. Instead, when it was still 50 meters away from the ground, it suddenly lit up with a light. The paratroopers who raided Rasha City previously used an automatic parachute, tailor-made by the mages of the Kingdom of Karen. The principle was very simple. When the height from the ground reached a certain standard, the magic circle would automatically trigger the mechanism and open the parachute. This was not a barometer, but a variant extension of the earth magic. Because it was developed with the help of the dragons, the success rate and accuracy were absolutely guaranteed. This crystal bomb also used a similar array. However, it did not activate the parachute, but the explosion array in the center. In fact, the first bomb also used the same magic circle, but because the activation height was set too low, it was completely extinguished before it could explode in the anti-magic domain. That was why it was such a joke. But this time, the magic circle inside the bomb successfully detonated the crystal at a high altitude. The magical metal fragments surrounding the bomb were blasted out. Boom! It was clearly daytime, but Vallard, who was watching this scene from afar, felt that the surrounding sky had darkened. The violent explosion caused countless metal fragments to spread out at supersonic speeds, and the radiation covered the bodies of the cavalrymen below. Because the violent explosion occurred 30 to 40 meters in the air, it was not affected by the anti-magic domain at first, but when it spread out, the energy flow of the crystal instantly disappeared when it neared the ground. But before that, the impact and fragments produced by the explosion had already completed their acceleration. Faced with such a completely physical attack, the armored cavalrymen were as fragile as thin paper. Those who were close to them were instantly squashed into meat paste along with their horses. Those who were slightly further away were pierced by the metal fragments, and were sent flying by the impact of the impact. The impact of the explosion, even from 500 meters away, was enough to make the Lockman soldiers who were holding up their shields feel great pressure. Many of the soldiers in the front row were caught off guard and fell backward, not to mention the Bindu cavalrymen within 100 meters of the explosion. It was just a bomb, but more than 200 of the Bindu cavalrymen who were spread out to rest died on the spot. More than 300 cavalrymen were injured by the fragments and fell to the ground in pain. Almost all the horses were startled by the loud noise, and many of them were overturned on the spot, fleeing for their lives. Some were even directly killed by the shock. The fragments flew too far, and even affected the Lockman soldiers who were 500 meters away. Some of the unlucky soldiers were hit on the spot, and 7 or 8 of them were killed or injured. But at a time like this, no one had the time to ask why the reconnaissance plane would accidentally injure their allies. The Bindu cavalrymen were scared out of their wits by this attack. They did not understand what had attacked them, but the wailing crowd let them know that if they did not leave now, they would be done for. The only remaining leader quickly gathered the injured cavalrymen and tried to calm the frightened and injured warhorses before preparing to escape. But they had just left behind a pile of corpses and ran away when another reconnaissance plane flew over. The sound of the propeller that they were used to was now like the whisper of the Grim Reaper. The Bindu cavalrymen were completely scared out of their wit. They howled and tried to speed up their horses, but how could horses outrun a plane? The reconnaissance plane, which had absolute air supremacy, was not worried that the enemy would counterattack. It aimed at the crowd and dropped another bomb. "Raise your shields! Raise your shields!" This time, Valad did not dare to observe the battlefield from the back of his horse. When the plane lowered its altitude, he jumped off his horse without any manners. He raised his hand and threw a shield scroll. He then hid under the shield raised by the guards without a care for his image. A deafening explosion echoed again. This time, due to the distance and the timely release of Valord's shield, the team wasn't accidentally injured. However, when he stood up and looked into the distance, he involuntarily swallowed his saliva. Those cavalrymen who were arrogant and galloping in the formation just a moment ago were now completely disorganized from the explosion and scattered into shadows that fled in all directions. On the ground, the corpses of horses and cavalrymen were scattered in sight. Some were completely smashed into pieces, and the remaining injured were groaning in pain as they tried to get up. There were still diamond-shaped metal fragments stuck in their bodies, but after trying for a long time, they still fell to the ground under the watchful eyes of countless people and gradually stopped breathing. The sound of the propeller gradually faded away, but the battlefield of more than 40,000 people was so quiet that only the cawing of crows could be heard. "Sir, what should we do?" "Put the scouts on the periphery, and we will continue to advance towards Lasha city. Use the carriages to transport the injured and the dead. If we can't, just leave them here. The vanguard must advance towards Lasha city. We must enter the city as soon as possible." Although Valord's face was still calm, he lowered his head and found that his arm was trembling uncontrollably. He turned to look at the cavalrymen in the middle of the army and found that most of them were in a sorry state. Obviously, the frightened war horses had brought them a lot of trouble, but compared to the 2,000 ferocious Bindu cavalrymen, this was not a problem at all. End of chapter. Chapter 11:10. Because of this incident, the logistics unit of the Lasman army lost more than 700 soldiers, and more than 1,000 were injured. After counting the corpses in the distance, Valord got another number that he did not want to face. The Lasman army killed 247 enemies by relying on their archery and the lives of their infantrymen. On the other hand, the 2 air-dropped bombs from the Cullen Kingdom had caused 567 deaths on the spot and 670 people to lose the ability to move on this battlefield. Losing the ability to move was equivalent to death. In other words, the Kingdom of Karen killed nearly 1,000 elite cavalrymen without sacrificing a single soldier. Valord lost almost 1,000 people on his side, which was less than half a bomb. Valord felt that if he reported this to the Parliament would suspect him of making it up. Riding on horseback, he went back to Rassia city. For a moment, he was in a trance. He picked up the fragments of the bombs and looked at them carefully in his hand. At first, Valord wondered how the Kingdom of Karen could take back Rassia city with less than 2,000 soldiers. But now, he had no more doubts. The only thing Valord could think of now was how to step down as a commander. He did not want to be humiliated here with these soldiers. On the east wall of Rassia city, Roddy, who had witnessed everything, was explaining the tactical use of airplanes and bombs to Marinthra and Naife as if nothing had happened. Because they were far away, they did not understand it as well as Valord did. However, seeing that the enemy was directly destroyed by the 2 bombs, the 2 of them were curious about how this kind of thing was made. "When you go back to the Kingdom of Karen, I will take you to the military factory to have a look. After the airport is completed, you won't need to take a boat to Lasman anymore. You can take a plane and arrive in one day. It will be much more stable than the baby shadow dragon. Naife, you don't need to worry about contacting your classmates anymore. Even if you write to them, they will be delivered within 3 days. You can even come to attend academic conferences every weekend." "Really? That's great." As expected, Naife was beaming with joy. Rhodey looked at that familiar smile, and his originally tense mood relaxed a lot. As he spoke, Sodeler came to the bottom of the city wall and asked for an audience. It was obvious that he was here to report the military situation. Roddy gestured for them to come over. After everyone saluted each other, he said, You used the bomb pretty well. I'll definitely give you credit for this. To be honest, it was quite a risk. I was afraid that the reconnaissance plane would make a mistake when pulling that thing. Sottler did not look happy, because bombarding the cavalry was an idea he came up with on the spur of the moment. Otherwise, the 40,000 reinforcements might not have arrived at La Sia City today. The carrying capacity of the reconnaissance plane was limited. In order to load the bombs, most of the internal components were removed before takeoff in order to reduce the weight. Even so, the pilot still took a great risk in launching the bombs. The only fortunate thing was that 2 out of the 3 bombs were successful, and the enemy was blown away. But Sottler's face was still full of worry. This situation is really my fault. I didn't expect Lachman's troops to be so useless. If that Valad had even a tenth of the boldness of the opposing commander, he wouldn't have fallen into such a predicament. He knelt on one knee and asked for punishment. How could Roddy blame him? He directly helped him up. Don't think too much about things that have already been resolved. We have generational weapons and air superiority. In this situation, try not to rely on that group of useless people in the future. In any case, we only let them defend the city for the sake of safety. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone to them. The two stood on the city tower and looked into the distance. Sottler sighed. The reconnaissance plane reported that there are more than 5,000 people crossing the river over there, but there isn't enough cavalry to continue to pose a threat. As long as we can get them into the city tonight, the battle later will be much easier. How is the transport plane? According to the plan, starting tonight, the infantry division and mobile armor division will arrive one after another. It is estimated that they will arrive in 10 days. I just received news that the military factory has completed the production of a large transport plane. It is estimated that it will arrive here tomorrow afternoon. Sottler had a clear grasp of this information, but he was also a little worried. But I asked about the consumption of crystals for each round trip of the transport plane. This is a large number. I have considered this problem when making the plan. The initial consumption is still bearable, but this means that we have to earn enough money to recoup our costs. Sottler frowned slightly. Plunder? To put it bluntly, it is plunder. To put it nicely, it should be called a transaction. Roddy pointed at the scattered shadows on the horizon. The cavalry of Bindu made a deal with Lachman before. A large number of their weapons were bought from us. You probably didn't expect this, did you? Not only Sottler, but Marinthra and Naife also blinked. They never thought that the business of the kingdom of Karen could reach here. Then they were blown up by us? War is war and business is business. After the infantry division pushes the front line over, it's not like we are going to kill all of them or burn them down. I should put it this way. What we bring over is not only death, but also peace. Everyone can only develop after peace. After development, everyone can make money together. Roddy's words were very smooth, but Sottler understood a little after listening to him. Is this considered war wealth? Tasman is still suffering from internal strife. Didn't we provide their armaments? This model was actually somewhat similar to that of the United States during World War I and World War II. However, Roddy was not a capitalist but the prime minister of the country. The profits from this huge trade surplus were astonishing. He had to keep it firmly in his hands to ensure that the army listened to him, and thus the stability of his regime. However, too much trade surplus was not necessarily a good thing. That was why he joined forces with the dragons to print money to inflate the country. Otherwise, although the country would make money, the people would not be able to eat because of severe deflation. This had happened in Spain in history, and Roddy did not want to repeat the same mistake. These things were related to economics. In fact, Roddy did not even know half a bucket of water, and Sottler did not even know the slightest bit. He only knew that he was in charge of the military. After figuring out the strategic intentions of the Prime Minister, he did not ask anything else. He bowed and left to continue preparing for the defense of the city. Thank you to all the readers who have been by my side. Thank you for your support. I have to attend a wedding in another city in the next 2 days, so I need to rest. However, I have written 30,000 words in one go. Asking for a leave should be a good sign. End of this chapter. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.